Every day you live inside a perfectly constructed lie. This lie is so flawless that you don't even suspect its existence. It determines your decisions, shapes your beliefs, and controls your life, all while remaining completely invisible. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger made a discovery that revolutionized our understanding of human nature. He uncovered something frightening. When reality contradicts our beliefs, we don't change our beliefs. We rewrite reality. This capacity for self-deception turned out to be so profound that it shook the scientific community to its core. Now you're about to learn how your mind deceives you every single second, and why you have no idea it's happening. Get comfortable and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. We're getting started. So, Part 1. The Laboratory of Self-Deception. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger made a breakthrough that would permanently alter our understanding of human psychology. His initial aim wasn't to uncover anything earth-shattering. He simply wanted to explore how people respond when confronted with information that contradicts their existing beliefs. What he uncovered was unsettling, a revelation so deep-rooted in human behavior that it shook the psychological community to its core. Festinger named this phenomenon cognitive dissonance, a concept that exposed something profoundly troubling about how we handle truth. He discovered that the human mind has an extremely low tolerance for contradiction. Rather than thoughtfully examining conflicting evidence and adjusting our views, we often reshape reality to maintain internal consistency. The experiment that led to this insight was brilliantly straightforward, yet profoundly illuminating. Festinger recruited college students and had them carry out excruciatingly monotonous tasks for an hour. They repetitively rotated wooden pegs by small increments and moved spools onto trays, only to remove and replace them repeatedly. The activities were deliberately crafted to be mind-numbing. At the end of the session, participants universally agreed that the tasks were painfully dull. But then came a twist that would redefine psychological science. Some of the students were asked to deceive the next participant in line, telling them the experiment was actually enjoyable and interesting. To motivate them, half were paid $20, a sizable amount at the time. The other half received just $1. Both groups delivered the lie convincingly. But what happened afterward exposed the astonishing mechanisms of self-deception. When the participants were later asked to reflect on their genuine feelings about the experience, the results were startling. Those who received $20 continued to describe the experiment as boring. They had a clear justification for their dishonesty, the substantial payment. However, those who were paid just $1 underwent a remarkable shift. They began to believe that the tasks weren't so bad after all, that they had actually been somewhat enjoyable. Pause for a moment to grasp the weight of this finding. These were bright, rational college students. They had just spent an hour performing absurdly tedious tasks and had initially acknowledged how boring it was. But when the discomfort of lying for such a small reward clashed with their self-image, their minds rewrote the narrative. They genuinely came to believe the falsehoods they had told. This wasn't deliberate deception. These students weren't trying to mislead the researchers or save face. They truly believed what they were saying. Their minds had edited reality so seamlessly that they were unaware it had happened. The illusion was so complete that even the illusionist, the brain itself, was unaware it had performed a trick. This is the essence of cognitive dissonance, and it shapes your thoughts more often than you realize. Festinger had uncovered a startling truth about human nature. We are not primarily rational beings who occasionally fall into error. We are fundamentally irrational beings who have learned how to mask that irrationality with the appearance of logic. The mind doesn't naturally seek truth. It seeks psychological comfort. And when comfort and truth collide, comfort almost always prevails. What's more, this mental sleight of hand happens without our awareness. Subsequent studies expanded the scope of Festinger's discovery. One of the most telling involved a doomsday cult that had predicted the end of the world on a specific date. When the day came and went without incident, the members didn't abandon their beliefs. Instead, they convinced themselves that their collective faith had prevented the catastrophe. In their minds, failure had transformed into success. This was cognitive dissonance in its most extreme form, where reality bends so dramatically that a failed prophecy is reinterpreted as a fulfilled one. But perhaps the most unsettling finding came years later, with the help of modern neuroscience. Advanced brain scans have shown what actually happens in our brains when we experience cognitive dissonance. During these moments, the regions responsible for logical thinking begin to power down. At the same time, emotional centers of the brain become hyperactive, lighting up dramatically. Ironically, it is precisely when we need clear, rational thought the most that our capacity for it starts to shut off. Scientists have observed this phenomenon in real time, watching as our reasoning faculties fade while emotion takes control. You can actually witness the precise moment when reason gives way to emotion. When individuals are presented with information that contradicts their core beliefs, their capacity for logical thought effectively shuts down. In these instances, emotion takes full control. Our minds cease any meaningful analysis. We aren't truly thinking. Instead, we're experiencing emotions first, and then retroactively crafting elaborate rationalizations to justify them. This is why presenting facts rarely changes anyone's mind. It's also why evidence can reinforce false beliefs instead of weakening them. And it's why highly intelligent people are capable of believing things that are clearly false. Their intelligence isn't being used in pursuit of truth. It's being weaponized to defend emotional reactions. In fact, the more intelligent they are, the more adept they become at deceiving themselves. The consequences of this understanding extend into every corner of life. It affects our relationships, our professional choices, our political affiliations, and even our moral convictions. We are not the logical beings we claim to be. At our core, we are emotional organisms, cloaked in the illusion of rationality. Perhaps most unsettling is the fact that we are completely unaware of the disguise. The mask is so flawlessly constructed that even the wearer is blind to its existence. Part 2. The Mental Toolbox of Deception. Buried deep within your psyche lies a hidden collection of psychological instruments, tools far more intricate than anything found in a magician's kit. These mechanisms lack familiar names, come with no user guides, and offer no clear instructions or cautions. Yet they are always at work, operating beneath your awareness, subtly shaping your experience of the world. In psychological terms, they're called defense mechanisms. However, that clinical label hardly conveys their full significance. These mechanisms are far more than abstract mental processes. They're the invisible engineers of your inner world. They craft your version of reality, edit your personal narrative, and protect your sense of self. Without your knowledge, they're constantly at work, reshaping your experience from moment to moment. Among them, one of the most sophisticated is known as rationalization. Think of rationalization as the internal spin doctor of your mind. Its purpose is to take your actions, thoughts, and emotions, regardless of how questionable they might be, and repackage them into a narrative that portrays you as logical, ethical, and justified. The actual facts become irrelevant. What matters is creating a story that allows you to feel comfortable with yourself and to rest easy at night. Rationalization has the power to turn even the worst behavior into something seemingly noble. Take, for instance, a student who cheats on an exam. The plain truth is that they weren't ready and broke the rules to get a better grade. But almost instantly, rationalization steps in. Now, the cheating seems reasonable. Everyone is doing it. The professor is unfair, the test is flawed, or they've earned a break after working so hard in other classes. This internal PR machine can generate a limitless series of justifications, each sounding more plausible than the last. What makes rationalization especially compelling is that it doesn't feel like a fabrication. The student isn't deliberately lying. They genuinely believe the reasoning they've constructed. Their mind has reassembled the events into a version of reality that feels consistent and ethically acceptable. The cheating no longer registers as cheating. It now appears as a justified reaction to an unjust situation. The deception is so effective that even the one being deceived remains unaware. This is the signature of a truly powerful illusion, when the liar is also the believer. Yet rationalization is just one among many tools at your mind's disposal. Another, perhaps even more subtle, is projection. This mechanism works by taking thoughts, feelings, and desires you find unacceptable in yourself and projecting them onto others. It flips your inner world outward, placing onto the external world the very qualities you're unwilling to acknowledge within. Someone harboring racist attitudes, for example, may become convinced that those around them are prejudiced. A partner entertaining thoughts of infidelity may suddenly grow suspicious of their spouse's loyalty. A corrupt politician may constantly accuse others of dishonesty while ignoring their own misconduct. Projection doesn't merely hide your inner conflicts. It enlists the outside world to confirm a sanitized version of who you are. This process is both precise and selective. It targets specific people and attributes to them exactly what is needed to keep your self-image intact. A man prone to outbursts may see hostility in everyone but himself. A woman feeling intellectually inadequate might interpret others as arrogant or dismissive. In effect, projection turns your environment into a kind of psychological mirror, one that reflects everything but the parts of yourself you cannot face. The world becomes a distorted echo of your own suppressed inner reality. Then there is denial, a mechanism that operates differently but with equal force. Unlike rationalization, which reshapes the narrative or projection, which relocates internal discomfort, denial simply eliminates the unwanted reality altogether. It functions like a mental delete button, wiping away facts that threaten your psychological stability. Think of the alcoholic who insists they have control, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, or the individual drowning in debt, continuing to spend recklessly as if nothing is wrong, or the spouse who turns a blind eye to clear signs of betrayal. Denial doesn't engage with the truth, it erases it. To the mind caught in denial, the problematic reality never existed in the first place. What's truly remarkable is how effective this illusion can be, at least in the short term. These defense mechanisms were not designed to make us virtuous, content, or even successful. They evolved for a more fundamental purpose: to preserve our psychological balance when faced with threats that might otherwise break us. In moderation, defense mechanisms act as psychological buffers. They shield us from emotional wounds and setbacks that could otherwise overwhelm our ability to function. A bit of rationalization can help us move beyond our errors without drowning in remorse. Some denial allows us to carry on even while knowing our lives are finite. A measure of projection can preserve our sense of worth in a world that often undermines it. However, like all potent tools, these mechanisms become hazardous when relied upon too heavily. What starts as an occasional coping strategy can evolve into a persistent habit that skews perception and clouds judgment. Someone who frequently rationalizes may lose the capacity to honestly own their behavior, falling into a repetitive loop of excuses that obstruct genuine progress. The person who consistently projects begins to see threats where none exist and finds trust difficult to place, fostering a worldview steeped in suspicion that eventually becomes reality. The chronic denier, meanwhile, constructs an increasingly distorted version of life, sidestepping issues until they escalate into full-blown crises. What's particularly alarming is how these defenses don't just coexist, they amplify each other. Rationalization gives denial a seemingly logical backbone, dressing up avoidance as reasonable thought. Projection, in turn, supports rationalization by offering external proof that the fault lies with others. Denial then protects projection by keeping us blind to the extent of our own deflections. Combined, these defenses form a tightly woven web of self-deception, increasingly impervious to outside influence. The more we lean on them, the more indispensable they appear. Eventually, an individual's entire perspective becomes dependent on maintaining complex illusions about themselves and their environment. The most tragic aspect is that most people are completely unaware they're employing these mechanisms. They operate beneath conscious awareness, altering our perception before we even recognize it as such. By the time a thought surfaces, it has already been shaped, filtered, and modified to fit what we already believe and how we see ourselves. We don't observe reality and then interpret it. We perceive an interpretation and assume it's real. These defenses become so embedded in our thinking that we lose the ability to tell the difference between true perception and psychological distortion. This is precisely why self-awareness is so elusive and meaningful personal change so uncommon. The very psychological tools we need to investigate in order to understand ourselves are the ones that block our ability to do so. It's a paradox, like attempting to look at your own eyes without a mirror, or trying to lift yourself by tugging on your own shoelaces. These mechanisms of self-deception are deeply ingrained, automatic, and vital to how our minds operate. They're not flaws in the system. They are integral components, and they function exactly the way they're meant to. Part 3. The Theater of False Choices. Jean-Paul Sartre grasped a profound truth about human nature that eluded many of his philosophical peers. As he sat in war-torn Paris, observing everyday people under the weight of extraordinary events, he came to a startling realization. The most dangerous lies we tell aren't about what we've done, but about what we claim we couldn't have done. This self-deception he called bad faith. Bad faith stands as one of the most intricate and subtle forms of self-delusion ever identified. It doesn't merely involve lying to oneself about reality, it's a lie about what could have been. Sartre's insights stem from a bold foundational idea. Human beings are radically free, not in a vague political sense, but in the deeply personal, existential sense. At every moment, we are actively shaping who we are through our actions and decisions. You are constantly making choices about who you are and how you behave. Even in the grip of external pressures, your reaction remains your own. When societal norms demand compliance, the decision to conform or to push back is still yours. Even in moments of extreme duress, even at gunpoint, you retain the power to choose your response. This freedom is total. It is inescapable. And it is utterly terrifying. For many, the natural impulse is to run from it. Bad faith is the intricate defense mechanism we build to deny the burden of this freedom. It whispers that we were trapped, that we had no real say, when in truth we always did. It is the inner monologue that convinces you change is impossible, that you're stuck in your career, your habits, your relationships, your entire life. It masquerades as safety, but is in fact a prison built from your own fears. And what makes it especially dangerous is its ability to imitate wisdom. Bad faith often wears the mask of maturity, responsibility, and rational decision-making. It cloaks fear in the language of caution and disguises avoidance as realism. Sartre illustrated this concept through the image of a waiter in a cafe. If you watch a waiter closely, he said, you'll notice they're not simply performing tasks. They're playing the part of a waiter. Every movement is too refined, every gesture too rehearsed. The smile is fixed, the posture exaggerated, the behavior almost theatrical. In fully inhabiting this role, the individual convinces themselves that this identity, waiter, is the totality of who they are. Their humanity becomes confined within a role, a script. In exchange for the frightening openness of possibility, they accept the comfort of limitation. And this, Sartre argued, is something we all do, often without realizing it. Consider the mother who insists she had no option but to give up her ambitions for her children. Or the employee who believes their job is a life sentence because of bills, family, and realistic concerns. Or the partner who remains in a toxic marriage, convinced that leaving would be too chaotic, too costly, too selfish. In each of these scenarios, authentic choices are reframed as unavoidable obligations. This is the core mechanism of bad faith, the quiet transformation of freedom into fate, of openness into duty. It's such a seamless and persuasive process that even those trapped within it rarely recognize what they're doing. The mother may truly believe no other life was possible. The worker may feel genuinely trapped. The spouse may fully believe they're doing the right thing by staying. But Sartre would challenge all of them. He would say that these people are not confronting the true nature of their existence. They are not objects being moved by circumstance. They are subjects pretending to be powerless. They are creators of meaning who have convinced themselves they are mere victims of external demands. Every version of bad faith follows this same formula. It turns choices into inevitabilities. This illusion can take several forms. Sometimes it appears as outright denial. A person says they can't do something, when in reality they could, if only they were prepared to accept the consequences. Other times, it's a matter of magnifying real but manageable obstacles. The person admits that alternatives exist, but makes them seem impossibly difficult or impractical. And often, bad faith manifests through appeals to outside authorities. A person claims they have no choice because their culture expects it, their religion demands it, their family insists on it. They allow these forces to dictate their actions, all in an effort to avoid the burden of having to choose and to be responsible for that choice. In every case, the goal is the same: to escape the weight of freedom by surrendering to something external. But Sartre insists, no matter how convincing the story, no matter how rational the justification, we are still the authors of our own lives, whether we acknowledge it or not. Picture a young woman on a first date, an example often cited by Sartre. Her date offers a compliment, praising her appearance, yet she chooses to interpret his words as admiration for her intellect or personality instead. When he reaches for her hand, she doesn't grasp it in return, nor does she pull away. She lets her hand remain, unmoving, as though it no longer belongs to her or responds to her intentions. She behaves as though her hand were a lifeless object, detached from her conscious control. In doing this, she attempts to sidestep the emotional and romantic implications of the moment by acting as though no decision is required. Yet paradoxically, her refusal to choose is itself a choice. She opts for ambiguity, delaying commitment and sidestepping accountability. This illustrates the core contradiction of what Sartre calls bad faith. Even when we attempt to reject our freedom, we are still exercising it. To deny freedom is, ironically, to act freely. To claim we are powerless is itself an act of power. The moment we decide to see ourselves as helpless, we are making a conscious decision. Our freedom is inescapable, no matter how much we try to deceive ourselves otherwise. At best, we can obscure it, not eliminate it, and that deception becomes one more deliberate choice in the ongoing story of our lives. But why would someone choose self-deception about something so fundamental? Because genuine freedom is frightening. True freedom comes with full responsibility for every action, every failure, every success, and every possible future. Embracing your freedom means accepting that you alone are accountable for who you are and what you become. To fully acknowledge your freedom is to relinquish the safety of blaming others. Your upbringing, your environment, your culture, biology, history, or inherent flaws. It means realizing that every instant calls for moral judgment. Each decision reflects not just what you do, but who you are. This burden of radical responsibility is more than many can bear. It's far easier to believe that life is something that happens to you, that you are swept along by currents beyond your control, than to face the reality that you are shaping it every moment through your decisions. It's more comforting to imagine yourself as merely following a script than to confront the truth that you're both writing and performing the play. Bad faith offers a tempting escape from the overwhelming responsibility of total freedom. It offers the illusion that the weight of choice belongs to someone or something else. But the cost of that illusion is devastating. You forfeit your very humanity. In denying your freedom, you deny what makes you a conscious, autonomous being. You transform yourself from an originator into an object, from a decision maker into a passive bystander. You relinquish the possibility of living authentically in exchange for the safety of a fixed role. The true tragedy is that this bargain is never required. The freedom you seek to avoid is unshakable. The responsibility you try to run from cannot be transferred. Bad faith does not strip you of freedom, it only makes you unaware of it. It doesn't absolve your responsibility, it only numbs your awareness of it. You are still the one steering your life, even if you've convinced yourself that someone else is holding the wheel. Part 4. There are no facts, only interpretations. Friedrich Nietzsche launched one of the most profound critiques of human certainty ever formulated. Writing in the twilight of the 19th century, this provocative German thinker examined the confident assertions of science, religion, and moral philosophy, and perceived something radically different. Where others saw truth, Nietzsche detected perspective. Behind every supposed fact, he found an underlying interpretation. Beneath every claim to objectivity, he discerned a subjective bias. What appeared to be eternal principles were, in his view, culturally conditioned judgments masquerading as universal truths. His declaration, "There are no facts, only interpretations," was not a rejection of truth itself, but a daring exploration of its elusive nature. Far from promoting a nihilistic relativism, Nietzsche was offering a deeply original insight that truth, as we know it, is inseparable from the creatures who seek it. To Nietzsche, facts are not pristine, neutral data. They are shaped by the interpretations of conscious beings, beings driven by needs, instincts, fears, and limitations. Every piece of information we absorb is filtered through the lens of our biology. Thought is never context-free. It is born within particular cultures, shaped by specific environments, and guided by unique life experiences. Belief is not generated in a vacuum. There is no view from nowhere, no all-seeing position from which objective reality can be grasped in its entirety. We are always interpreting, and our interpretations are inextricably linked to who we are and what we value. Even something as seemingly straightforward as the perception of color illustrates this point. You look at a rose and declare it red. It seems like the most basic truth, but Nietzsche would challenge that certainty. The rose itself does not contain redness as an inherent property. It simply reflects certain wavelengths of light. Your eyes capture those wavelengths and transmit them to your brain, which then constructs the sensation of red. Now imagine another creature, one with a different sensory system. A bee, for instance, detects ultraviolet patterns we cannot perceive. A dog's color vision is limited, distinguishing mostly shades of brightness. A bat sees using echolocation, interpreting the rose not through color, but through sound. So which experience reveals the real rose? Nietzsche's answer: none of them, or rather, all of them, are interpretations. The notion of a true, unmediated nature of the rose is meaningless without an observer. Truth arises not from objects themselves, but from the interplay between perceiver and perceived. This insight goes well beyond sensory perception. It reaches into the heart of science, ethics, politics, and art. Every scientific theory, every moral stance, every political ideology, every aesthetic preference originates from a particular mental and cultural perspective. Though science presents itself as objective and universal, Nietzsche saw its deeply human foundation. Scientists ask the questions that matter to them, use tools and methods they find reliable, and seek answers that align with human goals. Consider the periodic table. Far from being a purely objective map of reality, it is a conceptual framework designed to satisfy human curiosity and enhance our ability to control the natural world. It's a powerful and practical tool, but not a revelation of absolute truth. Moral systems reveal perspectivism even more vividly. Each culture constructs moral codes that address its specific realities. In ancient Sparta, a warrior ethos prized bravery, honor, and sacrifice. Renaissance Italy's merchant societies extolled strategic thinking, caution, and financial success. Medieval Christian communities elevated humility, charity, and spiritual devotion. These values make sense within their respective worlds and serve the needs of the people who live by them. But none can legitimately claim to be universally valid. What is virtuous in one time and place may be condemned in another. Each moral system reflects a particular set of circumstances and priorities. Nietzsche called this recognition perspectivism. He regarded this realization as both exhilarating and unsettling. It is liberating because it breaks the hold of rigid authorities, those who insist they possess the one true path to live, think, or believe. If there are no final, absolute truths, then no authority can impose a single worldview as definitive. If all claims to truth emerge from perspectives, then no one perspective can rightly rule over all others. Every perspective becomes part of an ongoing dialogue, not a final judgment that silences all others. This creates a space for imagination, risk-taking, and the emergence of new frameworks for interpreting and valuing life. Yet perspectivism also carries a deep unease. It strips away the comforting illusion of certainty that people often rely on. If what we call facts are merely interpretations, then how can we determine which ways of living are better or worse? When every viewpoint is inherently partial and limited, how are we to choose which ones deserve our commitment? In the absence of objective truth, what safeguards us from descending into complete relativism, where everything is permitted and nothing has meaning? Nietzsche grappled with these dilemmas throughout his life, and even he never found answers that were entirely satisfying. He proposed that perspectives be judged by whether they affirm or diminish life. But he also admitted that even this standard is rooted in a particular valuation, that life itself is worth affirming. The psychological consequences of perspectivism are far-reaching. Most people go through life assuming that the way they perceive the world is simply how the world is. They confuse their own viewpoint with objective reality. When confronted with perspectives that differ from their own, they tend to assume those others are either misinformed, irrational, or deceptive. The idea that multiple equally valid interpretations could coexist either seems implausible or threatens to destabilize their entire belief system. Perspectivism challenges this comforting illusion by showing that everyone is constrained by the limits of their own vantage point. This doesn't imply that all perspectives are equally valid or equally effective. Some interpretations are broader in scope, more logically consistent, better at predicting outcomes, or more useful in practical terms. But none of these attributes make them absolutely or universally true. Instead, they are better or worse depending on the goals and contexts in which they are applied. A scientific model that accurately predicts phenomena and facilitates technological progress may be more effective in certain contexts than a religious belief system that offers meaning and moral orientation. However, that same religious worldview might address existential concerns that science cannot resolve. Neither perspective can claim access to an ultimate or absolute truth, because such a truth may not exist at all, only a range of interpretations that vary in usefulness depending on the situation. This coexistence of divergent yet internally coherent perspectives is central to Nietzsche's idea of the death of God, the erosion of absolute values that once grounded human understanding. Perhaps the most unsettling implication of perspectivism lies in what it means for self-knowledge. If all we have are interpretations, then even the narratives we construct about ourselves, our identities, motives, and character, are just that, interpretations, not objective facts. What you believe about who you are and why you act as you do is shaped by perspective, not by some fixed or inherent truth. This realization unlocks extraordinary potential, but also profound uncertainty. If your current understanding of yourself is merely one of many possible interpretations, then you have the capacity to redefine yourself in radically different ways. Yet this also implies that any sense of a stable, enduring identity may be an illusion. You might be nothing more than a constellation of perspectives, loosely organized around a particular body and a shared set of memories. The question of your true self may ultimately have no answer, beyond the stories you and others construct to make sense of the patterns in your thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Part 5. The Grand Illusion. In the sacred temples of India and the meditation sanctuaries of Tibet, an extraordinary view of human existence arose, one so profound it renders even the most advanced Western psychological theories simplistic by comparison. Rooted in Buddhist philosophy, this worldview presents a penetrating diagnosis of the human condition, so complete and so unsettling that it calls into question nearly every assumption you've ever held about yourself and the nature of reality. This tradition doesn't merely suggest you're mistaken about the details of life. It argues that your entire framework of understanding is flawed at its core. What you perceive as reality is not reality at all. It's a complex and convincing illusion. The self you believe yourself to be is not a singular, enduring identity, but rather a series of ever-changing processes with no central core. What you chase as happiness is often just a cleverly disguised form of suffering, temporarily alleviated by fleeting pleasures. Perhaps most unsettling of all is this: you are not merely caught in this illusion, you are its primary architect. You are its most dedicated builder and its most faithful believer. The Buddhist concept of Maya offers a staggering portrait of human self-deception, far exceeding anything proposed in Western psychological models. While often translated simply as illusion, Maya is far more than a passive deception. It is an active creation. Maya is not like watching a film and mistaking it for real life. It is more akin to living inside a virtual reality system, one you are programming yourself in real time through your desires, fears, memories, and expectations. With every waking moment, your mind constructs a version of reality, not to reflect the world as it is, but to serve your emotional and psychological needs. You are not uncovering the world, you are fabricating it. And what you fabricate is a world carefully designed to uphold the illusion of a fixed, autonomous, enduring self, navigating a world of stable, external objects. According to Buddhist thought, this is the fundamental delusion. The illusion doesn't start with the world. It begins with the belief in your own selfhood. Right now, you likely feel as though there is a singular you inside your mind, someone who is reading these words, having thoughts, making decisions. This inner self feels so immediate, so intimate, so obvious that questioning it seems absurd. Yet Buddhist inquiry shows that this so-called self is nothing more than a continuous stream of mental and physical processes. There is thought, but no unchanging thinker. There is experience, but no permanent experiencer. There are sensations, perceptions, mental reactions, and awareness, but no inner controller behind it all. What you call your self is like a river. It maintains the appearance of continuity, while the water that makes it up is constantly changing, never the same from one moment to the next. This insight cuts to the core of human behavior. Almost everything we do is driven by the impulse to protect, enhance, or fulfill this self that, upon closer inspection, does not truly exist. You pursue success in your career, yet there is no enduring self to benefit from that success. You acquire material possessions to feel secure, though there is no solid self to truly possess them. You seek pleasure and avoid pain to create happiness for yourself, but there is no fixed entity that can ever secure lasting happiness from external conditions. Your efforts, your ambitions, your anxieties, all of them arise from a mistaken understanding of what you are. You are trying to nurture a self that is not real, to defend a self that is not vulnerable, to perfect a self that has no permanent essence. This illusion extends far beyond identity. It also encompasses the nature of the external world. Buddhism teaches that what you perceive as the outside world is not an objective, fixed reality that you simply observe. Rather, it is a mental construction shaped by the mind's own mechanisms. Every perception you have is filtered through layers of past conditioning, present desires, and unconscious mental habits. You never encounter reality in its raw, unfiltered state. Instead, you experience a version of reality colored by your nervous system, your cultural upbringing, your personal experiences, and your current emotional state. That's why two individuals can look at the exact same situation and see completely different things. It's not the situation itself that they are seeing, it's their interpretations of it. What you call the world is actually the world as it appears to your mind, shaped by your history, filtered through your perspective, at your particular point in time. This process of mental construction is so instinctive and seamless that it typically goes unnoticed. Under ordinary conditions, you're unaware that you're actively shaping your perception of reality, because this shaping occurs beneath the level of conscious thought. By the time you're aware of something, it has already been interpreted, categorized, and placed within the framework of your existing beliefs. You think you're perceiving reality as it is, but in truth, you're projecting your expectations, fears, or desires onto the world. This is precisely why meditation holds such a central place in Buddhist practice. Only through cultivating exceptional levels of focus and mindfulness can you begin to catch even brief glimpses of how much mental fabrication underlies every moment of your experience. The real-world consequences of this insight are profound. Most of the suffering we experience doesn't arise from the events themselves, but from how we relate to them. You suffer not simply because painful events occur, but because you resist pain and grasp at pleasure. You suffer not because things change, but because you yearn for permanence in a world where permanence does not exist. The root of suffering is not a lack of something, but the belief that acquiring what you lack will bring lasting contentment, when in reality, lasting satisfaction cannot be attained through external conditions. All this suffering stems from a core illusion, the belief that you are a fixed, separate self living in a world of solid, unchanging objects, and that happiness can be secured by manipulating external reality. Buddhism not only identifies this delusion, it offers a path to freedom from it. True liberation comes when you penetrate the illusion of a separate, enduring self and see clearly that every experience is mentally constructed. This insight isn't a theoretical idea, but a direct and transformative recognition that alters your entire relationship to life. Once you perceive there's no unchanging self to defend, the fear that drives self-preservation begins to dissolve. When you realize the impermanence of all things, the impulse to cling becomes clearly futile. When you recognize that both joy and suffering are mental constructs rather than outcomes of external events, you no longer feel powerless in the face of circumstances. You begin to take full ownership of your inner life. Yet arriving at this understanding is incredibly challenging. It demands that you question the deepest assumptions and identities that define what it means to be human. You must be prepared to scrutinize not only your views about the world, but also the very notion of yourself as a separate, substantial being. You need to see through not just superficial misconceptions, but the foundational illusion that there is a you who can be misled in the first place. This is why enlightenment is often described in Buddhist tradition as a form of death and rebirth. The individual who sets out on the path is so profoundly changed by the journey that by the end, they are virtually unrecognizable, even to themselves. Awakening demands the total unraveling of every concept you've ever had about who you are and what reality is. For most people, such a radical transformation is too threatening to even consider. The ego will go to extraordinary lengths to protect its continuity, even to the point of hijacking spiritual teachings and repurposing them as tools for self-enhancement. But the very mind that generates suffering is incapable of freeing you from it, because the mind itself is the source of the problem. This is why Buddhist practice places greater emphasis on direct experiential insight than on intellectual comprehension, and on consistent, structured practice rather than occasional flashes of realization. The illusion of a separate self isn't a simple error in logic that can be corrected by thinking differently. It is a deeply conditioned perceptual habit that can only be uprooted through long-term, disciplined inquiry into the nature of consciousness. And even then, full liberation from the core illusions that shape human life usually requires decades of rigorous and devoted practice. Part 6. The Art of Political Truth Bending. On the night of June 17, 1972, 5 men were apprehended inside the offices of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a routine break-in, the sort of event that might merit a small column buried in the back pages of a newspaper. But this incident would grow into a political firestorm that ultimately brought down the President of the United States. What followed was a stunning display of the human mind's ability to defend the indefensible. The Watergate scandal became a textbook example of how skilled individuals can manipulate truth so thoroughly that they convince themselves, and others, that falsehoods are facts and wrongdoing is virtue. Although Richard Nixon was not directly involved in orchestrating the break-in itself, the way he handled the crisis revealed something critical about the psychological pressures of leadership. As more evidence emerged linking the burglary to his re-election committee, Nixon faced a choice. He could have embraced openness and accepted responsibility. Instead, he embarked on a path marked by denial, evasion, and concealment. Each maneuver appeared, at least in isolation, to serve a defensible purpose. Each fabrication seemed to be a means of safeguarding something greater than the truth. Each act of interference was rationalized as necessary in pursuit of higher goals. But as these decisions accumulated, they formed an intricate web of falsehoods that became nearly impossible to untangle. It's entirely possible that Nixon himself lost sight of where honesty ended and delusion began. In the end, it wasn't malevolent cunning that undid him, but rather the all-too-human tendency to deceive oneself, taken to a historic extreme. It all started with justifications so carefully constructed that they might have passed for moral reasoning in an ethics seminar. Nixon reassured himself that defending the office of the presidency took precedence over admitting to a relatively minor political misstep. He told himself that national interest would be compromised if certain facts came to light. He began to believe that he was the target of an unjust political vendetta. And if his opponents were playing dirty, then surely he was entitled to defend himself by any means necessary. Each new rationale was built upon the last, gradually forming a coherent internal narrative in which the cover-up was not merely acceptable, it was a moral imperative. In Nixon's mind, he was not committing crimes. He was acting as a statesman under siege. He saw himself as shielding the country from political chaos. The same psychological mechanisms that allow ordinary people to justify small-scale dishonesty, like cheating on a tax return or telling a harmful lie to a loved one, were at work in the highest office in the land. As scrutiny intensified, so did the rationalizations. When Congress requested access to White House recordings that could confirm his involvement in the concealment effort, Nixon invoked executive privilege. He maintained that a president must be able to speak candidly with advisors without fearing that every word will become political ammunition. This argument, in principle, held some validity, and it's likely Nixon truly believed that he was defending the sanctity of the presidency itself, rather than simply shielding himself from political fallout. But when pressure mounted further, he dismissed the special prosecutor investigating the case. He also accepted the resignations of senior Justice Department officials who refused to comply with that decision. Again, he couched his actions in the language of constitutional necessity, claiming to be preserving executive authority and avoiding a governance crisis. With each turn, Nixon framed himself not as a lawbreaker, but as a guardian of institutional integrity. This narrative was so persuasive that it didn't just convince Nixon. It resonated with many of his followers who came to view him as a casualty of political vengeance, rather than a leader corrupted by power. The most telling moment came when he proclaimed, "I am not a crook." By then, his administration was unraveling. Investigations had uncovered widespread abuses of power, and longtime allies were beginning to distance themselves. Yet Nixon appeared to believe every word of his declaration. In his mind, being a crook implied a selfish, criminal intent, and he had spent years convincing himself that his actions served a greater national purpose. He saw himself as defending national interests, preserving constitutional balance, and protecting the presidency from those he believed were intent on dismantling it. In his personal narrative, the lies, the obstruction of justice, the misuse of authority, these were not crimes. They were regrettable but necessary sacrifices made in the name of a higher mission. This is the chilling strength of moral self-justification. Justification has the power to turn any villain into the protagonist of his own narrative. Richard Nixon's approval ratings during the Watergate era offer a revealing case study of how collective rationalization operates. At the outset of his second term, Nixon enjoyed widespread public support, buoyed by diplomatic victories and a resounding re-election. His approval stood at 68%, a testament to his political strength. However, as the Watergate scandal slowly unraveled, his popularity began to erode, though not as rapidly as one might expect. Even after months of damning revelations and compelling testimony, nearly a third of Americans continued to stand behind him. These were not individuals who believed he was guiltless. In fact, many of his remaining supporters admitted, at least privately, that he had likely broken the law. But they clung to their support by crafting intricate justifications. Some argued that political corruption was universal, and Nixon's actions were no worse than those of his peers. Others contended that his achievements in foreign affairs outweighed any domestic misconduct. A number believed that forcing a president from office would inflict more harm on the nation than allowing a flawed leader to remain. They redirected the blame, claiming the real threat to democracy wasn't Nixon's behavior, but the investigation itself. Political justification differs from personal rationalization because it's entangled with group identity and partisan loyalty. Backing Nixon became less about the man himself and more about upholding a broader political identity, one rooted in party affiliation, ideological vision, and core values. To acknowledge Nixon's corruption was to confront a much deeper and more painful truth, that their political instincts had been misguided, that their team had erred, and that their worldview required reevaluation. For many, it was less painful to excuse Nixon's misdeeds than to endure the internal crisis that came with questioning their foundational beliefs. In defending Nixon, they were not just shielding him, they were defending their own sense of who they were and where they belonged politically. This is why major political scandals often deepen partisan rifts rather than bridge them. The more incriminating the evidence, the more complex and fervent the justifications become. As individuals double down on their original stance, truth fades behind tribal allegiance. Facts are no longer seen as neutral, but become ammunition in an ideological war, where winning takes precedence over being accurate. Watergate illustrates how widespread justification can lead to a kind of shared delusion, infecting even the most competent and ethical of people. Nixon's top advisors, many of them once guided by principle, found themselves ensnared in a culture of deception. They convinced themselves they were acting in the service of a higher purpose, defending the presidency, maintaining national order, preserving institutional continuity. Each person's rationalizations reinforced the next, forming an insular feedback loop where dissent was seen as betrayal and honesty became subversion. The White House turned into an echo chamber of groupthink, where truth was defined not by fact, but by what the group needed to believe in order to function. Loyalty came to be measured by one's willingness to uphold the shared illusion. This is how decent people commit indefensible acts, not through a single catastrophic lapse in morality, but through a slow, steady slide into positions that become increasingly difficult to defend. The real tragedy of Watergate wasn't merely that Nixon was forced to resign, but that his downfall was avoidable. The initial offense, a break-in and its mishandling, was comparatively minor. A candid admission at the start might have spared him and the country the worst of the fallout. But once justification set in, it built its own momentum, difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. Every lie necessitated more lies. Every excuse needed further rationalization to remain consistent. The deeper one goes into the architecture of deceit, the harder it becomes to step back into the light of truth. As the cost of honesty increased, Nixon found himself ensnared in a self-made trap. He could no longer walk away from the falsehoods without dismantling the entire structure of rationalizations he had built. In the end, he chose to sacrifice his presidency rather than face the full scope of his self-delusion. This is where unchecked justification ultimately leads, not just to a corruption of truth, but to the total surrender of reality itself to the ego's need to be right. Part 7. Prophets of Delusion. In the hills of California during the turbulent 1960s, a struggling musician named Charles Manson attracted a circle of young followers who would go on to carry out some of the most horrifying murders in U.S. history. Far from there, deep in the jungles of Guyana, a persuasive preacher named Jim Jones convinced more than 900 of his devoted followers to take their own lives in what he described as a revolutionary political act. And in the remote lands of Texas, David Koresh, a self-proclaimed prophet, built a reclusive compound that ended in a deadly siege when federal agents arrived to investigate serious allegations of child abuse and illegal weapons possession. These stories are often portrayed as tales of evil lunatics or deranged masterminds. But at their core, they reveal something far more unsettling: the logical endpoint of human rationalization when it is unchecked by external accountability or inner doubt. Cult leaders are not supernatural beings gifted with otherworldly charisma. They are people who have perfected the use of psychological tools that exist in every human mind. They are master manipulators, experts in the craft of rationalization, who construct elaborate illusions of meaning and purpose so convincing that even rational, well-educated individuals surrender their critical thinking, relinquish their independence, and sometimes even sacrifice their lives. It all starts with what psychologists term love bombing, a flood of affection, validation, and attention designed to make newcomers feel important, chosen, and deeply seen. This isn't spontaneous kindness, it's a calculated method to cultivate emotional dependency. People often find themselves drawn to cults at moments of vulnerability, after a loss, during times of transition, or when they feel disconnected and are searching for purpose. The cult appears to offer exactly what they crave: belonging, direction, answers, and unwavering acceptance. Yet this acceptance is never free. It carries hidden costs that surface only after the individual is firmly entrenched. The affection is real but conditional. The approval is sincere yet fleeting. The sense of belonging is authentic, but only if one slowly gives up the very traits that make them an individual. Cult leaders intuitively grasp something many overlook: that people crave certainty in an unpredictable world. They provide clear-cut answers to life's most difficult questions, moral clarity amid confusion, and unwavering truth in a culture filled with ambiguity. They claim access to extraordinary insight, whether through divine revelation, scientific breakthrough, or some form of spiritual awakening, which places them beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. Followers are taught that questioning this authority is not merely dissent, it is betrayal. Doubt is painted as weakness, critique is dismissed as ignorance, and skepticism is condemned as spiritual failure. The brilliance of cult control lies in its ability to turn independent thought into a source of guilt and fear, rather than insight and strength. Members are slowly conditioned to distrust their own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, replacing them with the leader's interpretations. When facts contradict the group's doctrine, it is not the belief that is questioned. It is reality itself that must be wrong. When personal experience clashes with the leader's teachings, that experience is explained away as ego, sin, or external corruption. This creates a closed belief system where no evidence can ever disprove the leader's claims. Any challenge is seen as an attack by hostile forces or the result of a tainted mind. Paradoxically, the more outrageous the leader's pronouncements become, the more they are seen as confirmation of divine or extraordinary status. After all, no ordinary person would dare make such grand claims. Therefore, they must be enlightened. And so, otherwise intelligent individuals begin to interpret clear delusion as deep wisdom. Isolation becomes essential to sustaining this artificial reality. Members are systematically distanced from family, friends, and external sources of information that might raise doubts or offer alternative perspectives. This separation is framed as necessary, whether for spiritual purification, ideological protection, or personal safety. The outside world is painted as corrupt, threatening, or spiritually dead, while the group is upheld as the sole keeper of truth, safety, and salvation. Members are gradually taught to interpret outside criticism not as legitimate concern, but as persecution, a sign that their group holds a unique truth too powerful for the world to accept. The more rejection they face from outsiders, the stronger their belief grows that they are custodians of something rare and invaluable, something the unenlightened simply can't comprehend. As the group's demands intensify, the rationalizations used to remain within it grow more intricate and convincing. At first, the expectations placed on members are modest, perhaps small financial contributions, regular attendance at meetings, or avoiding so-called negative influences. These early steps feel harmless, even beneficial, often framed as part of a journey toward personal transformation or spiritual awakening. But these requests are only the beginning. Soon the stakes rise: greater financial sacrifice, more time commitment, deeper social isolation, and stricter obedience. Each new imposition is made to seem like a natural continuation of past commitments. These escalating demands are justified through appeals to earlier choices, grander missions, or supposed exceptional circumstances. The deeper a person has invested, emotionally, socially, and financially, the harder it becomes to acknowledge that those sacrifices may have been misguided. This is the psychological trap of the sunk cost fallacy, now applied to one's entire identity. The more someone gives to a false belief system, the more desperately they need to believe in its truth to avoid the pain of regret. Eventually, members may find themselves participating in acts they would have once found morally indefensible. But by this stage, their ability to judge right from wrong independently has eroded so thoroughly that these actions now feel righteous, even necessary. One of the most disturbing aspects of this transformation is how members learn to rationalize the unacceptable by altering their sense of time and ethics. Current suffering is reframed as a necessary step toward eventual awakening. Self-denial becomes a mark of honor, a sacrifice made for a collective mission. Harmful behavior is excused as being in service of transcendent goals, goals that the unenlightened cannot hope to grasp. Members see themselves not as perpetrators of harm, but as heroes in a grand cosmic struggle where normal rules no longer apply. They don't believe they are causing pain. They believe they are setting others free. They aren't taking money. They're reallocating resources for a sacred cause. They aren't abandoning loved ones. They are choosing a purer, more elevated form of love. The more extreme the expectations become, the more special and chosen members feel for being able to rise above ordinary human limits. This is justification at its most dangerous, the complete moral inversion that turns vice into virtue through redefined ethics. What makes cult membership so tragic is not that people are brainwashed against their will, but that they willingly participate in their own psychological captivity. They do this because it fulfills emotional needs that come to feel more vital than truth or personal freedom. Many former cult members describe their time in the group as the most alive, meaningful, and connected they've ever felt, before or since. The loss of autonomy is experienced not as oppression, but as relief, the removal of the heavy burden of choice in a confusing world. Surrendering critical thinking feels like liberation from the exhausting pressures of doubt and ambiguity. Separation from the outside world is seen not as exile, but as protection from moral decay and spiritual pollution. These individuals are not merely manipulated by others, they are also ensnared by their own unmet psychological needs and by the elaborate stories they construct to satisfy those needs. It's crucial to understand how cult psychology functions, because the same dynamics play out in milder forms throughout everyday life. Many workplaces revolve around charismatic figures who demand loyalty at all costs. Social circles often enforce invisible boundaries about what is acceptable to question. Ideological communities have their own dogmas, where disagreement is treated as betrayal and criticism as ignorance or immorality. The true divide between cult behavior and everyday social dynamics lies not in whether people use justifications, but in how much reality they allow to challenge their internal beliefs. When justifications become airtight and the outside world is completely subordinated to inner narratives, cult-like thinking takes hold. And once this process is underway, it can build a momentum of its own, carrying people far from where they started, down paths they never intended to follow. The journey toward extremism is not marked by sudden leaps, but by a series of seemingly harmless rationalizations, each one paving the way for the next, until finally reason itself becomes the enemy. Part 8. Corporate Theater. In the glittering skyscrapers of downtown Houston, Enron executives convinced themselves they were leading a transformative shift in the energy sector and creating prosperity for millions of shareholders. At the offices of Wells Fargo, managers genuinely believed that their hard-driving sales strategies were helping customers by offering essential financial services. Meanwhile, in the conference rooms of Arthur Andersen, partners rationalized that their unconventional accounting methods were legitimate business tools designed to give clients an edge in increasingly competitive markets. These were not covert plots hatched by cinematic villains in smoky backrooms. Rather, they were vast, institutionalized systems of mutual self-deception, structures that allowed thousands of well-educated, capable professionals to commit fraud while continuing to see themselves as principled leaders in the corporate world. Such scandals highlight how the act of justification doesn't just take place in individual minds. it becomes woven into the fabric of entire organizations, making unethical behavior appear not only acceptable, but even admirable. Enron's rise began with a truly forward-thinking idea, a business model based on trading energy derivatives. This innovation allowed energy producers to hedge against market volatility, while also enabling Enron to profit from these transactions. At its core, this was a legitimate enterprise serving clear economic purposes. But as competition intensified and profit margins tightened, the company gradually resorted to accounting methods that first tested legal limits and eventually ignored them altogether. Each new tactic appeared, on its own, to be a logical extension of business strategy. Every innovation felt like another example of Enron's cleverness. Each deviation from conventional accounting was defended by appealing to the company's unique position in the evolving energy marketplace. Executives came to believe they were trailblazers, inventing new ways to generate value in a rapidly changing economy. As deception became more integral to their operations, the reasoning behind it grew more complex and more detached from reality. One of the most notable tactics involved the creation of special purpose entities, SPEs, which allowed Enron to keep liabilities off its balance sheet and inflate reported profits. These weren't presented as evasive maneuvers, but as sophisticated financial tools designed to more accurately capture the value of intricate energy contracts. When auditors began to challenge these practices, Enron's leadership argued that traditional accounting standards were obsolete and incapable of capturing the true nature of modern financial innovation. In their eyes, they weren't concealing debt. They were portraying a more accurate version of the economic substance behind their deals. That these practices made Enron appear far more profitable than it truly became, in their minds, not evidence of deceit, but confirmation that they were doing something right. As the pressure mounted to maintain an image of constant growth and success, the explanations became increasingly elaborate and increasingly removed from actual performance. One of the most critical shifts came when Enron began recognizing projected profits from long-term contracts as if the revenue had already materialized. This method, known as mark-to-market accounting, gave the company vast leeway in estimating future earnings. When these projects underdelivered, the company didn't report losses. Instead, it reclassified costs as assets, reasoning that since the projects hadn't officially been terminated, their value hadn't vanished. Underperforming divisions weren't shut down, they were shuffled. Employees were relocated and instructed to appear engaged whenever analysts visited, carefully maintaining the illusion of strong business activity. Each of these maneuvers was seen as a temporary bridge, a necessary step to preserve investor confidence until actual results caught up with optimistic forecasts. Executives did not believe they were falsifying performance. They believed they were managing market expectations, shielding their fundamentally sound business from being unfairly penalized for short-term turbulence. This entire web of rationalizations was sustained by a high-pressure corporate culture that prioritized outcomes over integrity. Internally, employees were subjected to a forced ranking system that demanded continual outperformance, regardless of what the market or company fundamentals could realistically support. Those who questioned the integrity of accounting methods were dismissed as short-sighted, resistant to innovation, or unwilling to embrace evolving business paradigms. Success became synonymous with rising share prices and reported profits, not with actual cash flow or responsible, sustainable operations. This created a self-reinforcing cycle in which dubious practices were affirmed by their seemingly successful outcomes. Ironically, those outcomes were themselves the product of those same questionable tactics. The upward trajectory of the company's stock was presented as evidence that these so-called financial innovations were effective, even though those market gains were built on distorted financial statements that misrepresented the company's true financial health. In a separate but equally revealing case, the Wells Fargo fake account scandal demonstrated another powerful form of organizational rationalization. Executives at the bank convinced themselves that pushing aggressive cross-selling metrics aligned with the company's mission of comprehensive customer service. Frontline employees were urged to open multiple accounts per customer and sell additional products, regardless of whether customers expressed interest or need. When staff raised concerns about the unrealistic nature of these expectations and the potential harm to customers, management countered that these sales goals exemplified the bank's dedication to full-spectrum financial support. Opening redundant accounts was rebranded as strategic relationship building. Selling unrequested services became a way to educate clients about financial opportunities. As the demands increased, some employees resorted to opening unauthorized accounts, creating fake emails, and even forging signatures, just to meet performance quotas. These unethical actions were internally rationalized as temporary stopgaps to avoid job loss, intended to buy time while cultivating real customer relationships. Supervisors who discovered these practices often looked the other way, meeting district performance benchmarks and safeguarding their own career trajectories took precedence over confronting systemic misconduct. They reassured themselves that these accounts would eventually be converted into legitimate ones as customers recognized their value. Customer complaints about being charged fees for accounts they never opened were downplayed as minor clerical issues that could be easily fixed by customer service teams. Rather than acknowledging a systemic failure, each instance was treated as an isolated mistake by a rogue employee, thereby concealing the broader ethical collapse fueled by flawed incentive structures. What made these corporate scandals particularly disturbing was how they endured through a shared delusion that rendered individual moral judgment nearly irrelevant. Employees were caught in systems where ethical conduct was penalized, while unethical behavior was rewarded. Yet the immorality was obscured by corporate jargon and rationalizations. At Enron, fraudulent activity was marketed as financial ingenuity. At Wells Fargo, deception was disguised as customer engagement. At Arthur Andersen, malpractice was reframed as client loyalty. These weren't cases of a few bad individuals spoiling healthy institutions. Rather, they were instances where organizational cultures systematically reshaped the values of fundamentally ethical people, convincing them that misconduct was not only permissible, but required and even commendable. The implications of such corporate rationalization go well beyond individual scandals or companies. When short-term profit maximization becomes the sole metric of achievement and quarterly earnings outweigh sustainable growth, entire industries risk falling into justification loops that normalize increasingly reckless behaviors. Banks defend exploitative lending practices under the guise of providing financial access to underserved communities. Drug manufacturers excuse exorbitant pricing by citing R&D expenses, even as they allocate more resources to marketing than to research. Tech firms rationalize intrusive data collection by pointing to the user benefits of personalization and convenience. In each of these scenarios, legitimate business goals are used to defend behaviors that primarily benefit corporate interests at the expense of public good. The real tragedy of corporate justification is not limited to the erosion of trust in a few institutions. It infects entire sectors and distorts the cultural understanding of ethical business conduct and corporate responsibility. When conformity is the norm, standing alone feels not only futile but irrational. In a landscape where regulators adopt the worldview of the industries they oversee and politicians rely on corporate funding to sustain their campaigns, any meaningful external oversight vanishes. Media outlets increasingly emphasize market performance over corporate ethics, while consumers often value affordability above responsible sourcing. Incentives built into the market system reinforce rather than challenge the rationale behind such behavior. This creates an ecosystem where corporate wrongdoing is no longer an exception, but an accepted feature, embedded, anticipated, and upheld by a sophisticated web of shared justifications stretching across corporations, sectors, oversight bodies, and political frameworks. In this reality, truth becomes a tool to serve the demands of quarterly earnings. What is considered real is simply what bolsters investor confidence and sustains stock valuations. Within such a system, the greatest threat does not come from those who knowingly deceive, but from the ideologues, those who genuinely believe that the pursuit of profit naturally serves the public interest. Part 9. The Digital Echo Chamber. In the glow of our ever-present screens, the act of self-justification has found its ultimate enabler. Social media platforms, engineered to capture attention and sustain engagement, have inadvertently built the most intricate architecture ever created for validating biases and reinforcing illusions. Every tap, every like, every repost teaches the algorithms to feed you more content that aligns with your existing views, and less that might contradict them. The consequence goes far beyond mere political division or cultural disunity. It signals the breakdown of a commonly held sense of truth. In this digital era, the tools of justification have been industrialized, automated, and deployed at a global scale. We're no longer just deceiving ourselves in isolation. We are actively participating in a mass, coordinated act of self-delusion. What starts as a harmless desire to engage with content that interests us soon morphs into something more insidious. We seek out articles that reflect our political stance, follow accounts that mirror our values, and interact with content that affirms our existing beliefs about how the world works. Each of these seemingly innocuous actions feeds data into algorithmic engines whose primary aim is to keep us on the platform as long as possible. These systems quickly learn that you're more inclined to engage with affirming content rather than with posts that challenge your assumptions. As a result, they systematically reduce exposure to dissenting viewpoints and increase the flow of content that reinforces your perspective. This isn't necessarily a conspiracy or a scheme of manipulation. It's simply a profitable business model. The platforms thrive on engagement, and nothing fuels engagement more reliably than content that makes you feel intelligent, validated, and morally right. Yet the psychological effects of this process are profound and often invisible to the very users caught in its web. Gradually, your feed evolves into a warped mirror of the world, highlighting information that supports your existing worldview while filtering out anything that might contest it. It begins to appear as though everyone around you shares your beliefs, your values, and your way of life. On the rare occasion that opposing views manage to break through, they often arrive in exaggerated or absurd forms, easy to mock or dismiss. These extreme representations of dissent create a false sense of overwhelming consensus and a belief that anyone who disagrees with you must be irrational, immoral, or deranged. Your confidence in your own views grows stronger, not because they are more informed, but because all opposing perspectives have been pushed out of sight or caricatured beyond recognition. The mechanisms of justification embedded within this digital environment are far more advanced than anything seen in previous generations. When you encounter information that contradicts your beliefs, you're not compelled to process it critically or formulate your own rebuttals. Instead, the platforms offer immediate access to vast communities of like-minded individuals who have already done that work for you. With just a few clicks, you can find fully formed rebuttals, conspiracy theories, and counter-narratives, many complete with professional-looking evidence, quotes from experts, and complex lines of reasoning. The mental labor of dismissing inconvenient truths has been crowdsourced to vast networks of individuals engaged in motivated reasoning. No longer must you strain to defend your beliefs. Thousands of others have already created intricate defenses on your behalf. These collective systems of justification form powerful feedback loops that magnify slight distortions into enormous departures from reality. A mild disagreement over policy becomes proof of irredeemable corruption. A flawed scientific paper becomes evidence that the entire scientific establishment is a fraud. A biased news report becomes confirmation that all media is inherently deceitful. Each layer of exaggeration builds upon the last, often enhanced by users adding their own emotional spin or ideological twist. The most sensational and emotionally charged interpretations get the most clicks, shares, and likes. This boosts their visibility and, in turn, their perceived credibility. In this digital arena, truth takes a back seat to popularity, accuracy yields to emotional resonance, and shared reality is sacrificed to serve the psychological cravings of fragmented online communities. Digital platforms are designed to amplify content that evokes intense emotional reactions, which leads them to consistently promote the most extreme, simplified interpretations of complex ideas. The rapid pace and vast reach of online communication have also reshaped how we justify our beliefs. Before the digital age, Individuals had time to process and reflect on challenging ideas before reacting. Disagreements typically occurred in face-to-face interactions, where social etiquette encouraged politeness and mutual understanding. With fewer sources of reinforcing information, people were either compelled to engage with conflicting perspectives or avoid contentious topics altogether. Now, social media incentivizes immediate, often unreflective responses to multifaceted issues, while offering endless streams of confirmation for any belief. This urgency to react undermines thoughtful deliberation, and the easy availability of supportive content reduces the necessity for intellectual humility. Arguments that once required hours of careful thought can now be replicated in moments through reposted talking points and viral soundbites. As a result, the speed and volume of justification surge, even as the quality of reasoning diminishes. What's particularly concerning is how these platforms have turned the act of justification into a game, where self-deception is not only normalized but also celebrated. Sharing content that reinforces group ideologies becomes a way to declare loyalty and gain approval within one's social circle. Refuting opposing views evolves into a kind of performance art, where the most scathing or clever rebuttals receive the most praise. Searching for evidence becomes a recreational pursuit, with the discovery of reinforcing information offering both joy and status. The process of defending beliefs starts to matter more than the pursuit of truth itself. Emotional satisfaction replaces the value of intellectual integrity. As people cluster around shared justifications rather than shared truths, new social incentives emerge that encourage ever more elaborate forms of self-deception. Those most adept at reinforcing collective illusions often rise to prominence as influencers, building careers around helping others sustain their preferred narratives. This doesn't merely lead to disagreements about facts, it results in fractured realities. Each digital community constructs its own version of the world, supported by its own experts, its own data, and its own internal logic. These groups don't just interpret shared events differently, they inhabit entirely separate realities, curated by algorithmic filters and social feedback loops. A political development might be hailed as a landmark achievement by one faction and condemned as a catastrophe by another. The same scientific report may be championed by some as validation and dismissed by others as manipulation. A cultural shift seen by one group as ethical advancement is viewed by another as moral decline. Each community possesses detailed justifications for its stance, and equally compelling reasons for why the opposing views must be false. However, these justifications often rest on fundamentally incompatible worldviews. The result is a digital landscape where the fragmentation of truth undermines the foundations of democratic life, social unity, and collective decision-making. When the population can't agree on core realities, such as economic conditions, scientific findings, or major political events, meaningful public discourse becomes impossible. Without a shared commitment to truth, even respectful disagreement breaks down, leading to mistrust and rising conflict. When any belief can be validated by a so-called expert, the very concept of expertise begins to erode. In such an environment, knowledge becomes indistinguishable from opinion. The very tools that were meant to democratize access to information and empower citizens have instead enabled a world where truth is defined by what feels good or aligns with one's identity. In this reality, where justification is instant and boundless, truth-seeking no longer offers meaningful rewards, and the consequences of self-delusion are pushed onto society at large. We are no longer merely misleading ourselves. We are engineering technologies that deceive us better than we could ever manage alone. And we're funding these systems, not in spite of the falsehoods they feed us, but because the lies are more comforting than the truth. Part 10. The Invisible Chains. After another grueling 14-hour shift at a job she loathes, Sarah sits alone in her car, convincing herself that quitting isn't an option. Her mortgage, her children's future education, and her elderly parents' healthcare costs form a wall of obligations she believes she cannot climb over. Meanwhile, Michael downs his fifth beer of the evening, reassuring himself that he's earned the right to unwind. The day has been filled with difficult clients and an overbearing boss, and he tells himself this is simply how he copes with the pressure. Jennifer spends her evenings scrolling through her ex-husband's social media feeds. She insists it's about safeguarding their children, not recognizing that she's struggling to let go of the past. David, on his third home refinance, tells himself he's simply managing a string of unlucky breaks. He refuses to see that it's not bad fortune, but chronic overspending that's dragging him down. These aren't the dramatic downfalls seen in tabloid headlines. They are the quiet, unnoticed struggles of everyday people bound by unseen chains, rationalizations they've forged themselves. The damage caused by persistent self-deception doesn't make front-page news. It accumulates in missed opportunities, diminished ambitions, and lives lived far short of their potential. What makes these rationalizations particularly dangerous is their disguise. They wear the mask of wisdom, of maturity, of making the right decisions. Sarah tells herself, and others, that she's being responsible, sacrificing her own aspirations for the well-being of her family. Michael believes his drinking is justified, a small indulgence after hard days. Jennifer paints her obsession with her ex as a form of devoted parenting, a way to stay involved for her kids' sake. David frames his financial juggling act as savvy money management, a strategic use of his assets to weather temporary cash shortfalls. In all these stories, harmful patterns are reframed as commendable choices. Not only do these narratives feel reasonable, they even sound virtuous, drawing praise rather than concern. These stories are often so convincing that even those closest to them, friends, family, co-workers, reinforce them. The people living within these self-constructed cages don't feel imprisoned. They feel noble, responsible, and unlucky. But behind these polished explanations lies a more uncomfortable truth, a refusal to acknowledge the power they do have to change. Sarah truly believes her job is the only realistic path for someone with her background and constraints, but she hasn't genuinely looked for alternatives in years. To do so would mean confronting the painful reality that she's been choosing this life, not merely enduring it. Michael clings to the belief that his anxiety must be medicated, that alcohol is a fair and necessary escape. He never asks whether his drinking might actually be fueling the very stress he claims it soothes, because doing so would force him to reconsider how he deals with discomfort. Jennifer insists that keeping tabs on her ex is for the children's benefit and her own peace of mind. But the truth is harder to face. Her monitoring only amplifies her anxiety and keeps her tethered to a past she refuses to release. Admitting that would mean accepting her loss of control and moving into the unknown. David tells himself his financial issues are circumstantial, a product of poor luck, not poor judgment. But he avoids scrutinizing his habits because doing so would mean facing the fact that his lifestyle simply doesn't match his means, no matter how much money he earns. Over time, the cost of these self-deceptions grows, not in obvious dramatic ways, but in slow erosion. Sarah's career doesn't stall because she lacks talent or options, but because she's convinced herself that progress isn't worth pursuing. Her justifications stop her from upskilling, networking, or even noticing when doors open. Michael's alcohol use escalates in tandem with his tolerance and growing stress, yet his explanations evolve just as quickly, keeping pace with his dependence. What was once an occasional crutch becomes a daily necessity, and then, without realizing it, a form of quiet addiction. What he calls coping turns into a hidden, functional alcoholism. Each phase in this pattern can be understood as a reasonable reaction to the pressures of the moment. Jennifer, for instance, remains emotionally tethered to her divorce, and this stagnation affects her children, her current relationships, and her personal growth. Yet she interprets these consequences as noble trade-offs, necessary costs in her pursuit of being a good parent. Meanwhile, David's finances slowly unravel as interest payments consume more and more of his earnings. Rather than addressing the overall size of his debt, David fixates on his monthly payments and convinces himself that a future promotion or the success of an investment will turn things around. In both cases, these rationalizations provide short-term emotional comfort, but create longer-term consequences that demand even more complex justifications to maintain a sense of inner balance. What's most tragic is that chronic self-justification gradually undermines the very abilities needed to break free from destructive cycles. The more one rationalizes unwise choices, the more skilled they become at doing so, and the less capable they become of making sound decisions. Avoiding problems by explaining them away leads to a decline in actual problem-solving ability. When individuals externalize blame for decisions they've made internally, they weaken their own capacity for meaningful action. Refusing to confront difficult truths about oneself limits self-awareness, which in turn stunts the ability to make corrective changes. Justification operates like a mental muscle. The more it's exercised, the more dominant it becomes, causing other vital cognitive strengths to weaken from disuse. Those who rely heavily on justifying their choices often report feeling trapped, powerless, and overwhelmed, even when they have the means to enact real change. Over time, they come to interpret their reality through a lens of limitation, seeing barriers where there could be opportunities, perceiving problems instead of potential, and imagining restrictions in place of agency. But the consequences of personal justification extend beyond the individual. Children who observe this behavior in their parents frequently internalize similar patterns, passing down habits of self-deception through generations. Romantic partners may either fall into the role of enabling these destructive habits or find themselves in escalating conflicts about behaviors that are never acknowledged as harmful. Friends and coworkers are drawn into these dynamics, often compelled to choose between being honest or remaining loyal. Workplaces adjust to accommodate employees who rationalize poor performance, eroding standards and weakening accountability. Entire communities may come to accept dysfunction as normal when enough people collectively excuse persistent issues, making meaningful reform seem unnecessary or even impossible. The broader economic impact of widespread justification is immense, though seldom acknowledged. Millions remain stuck in roles that waste their abilities, having convinced themselves they have no better options. Many businesses plateau or collapse because their leaders defend the status quo instead of confronting hard truths. Entire industries become stagnant when justification becomes embedded in their organizational culture. Healthcare systems are overwhelmed by the need to treat preventable conditions, driven by lifestyle choices that individuals defend rather than change. Education struggles to foster critical thinking in students who have been conditioned to value emotional security over intellectual challenge. Legal systems become jammed with conflicts rooted in people's refusal to recognize their own part in the problems they face. Democratic societies suffer when citizens justify their political stances instead of examining them with clarity and reason. But beyond these structural costs, perhaps the greatest loss brought on by habitual justification is existential in nature. People who spend their lives defending their choices instead of improving them miss the chance to discover their full potential. They stay confined within diminished versions of themselves, less dynamic, less fulfilled than what they could be. Life, for them, becomes something that happens to them, not something they actively shape through thoughtful choices and intentional action. Many people unknowingly train themselves to feel powerless in the face of their most critical life challenges and blind to the opportunities that could transform their lives. They confuse the reasons they give for their current state with who they are, and interpret their self-imposed limits as their true nature. In an effort to shield themselves from the fear that comes with taking responsibility and the discomfort that comes with personal growth, they end up confining themselves to lives of reduced potential and abandoned aspirations. Ironically, the very strategies they adopt to avoid pain become the source of their greatest suffering. The mental and emotional barriers they create to feel safe gradually turn into the walls of a self-made prison. What's most heartbreaking is that these barriers are never as heavy as they seem, and the prisons they construct are always easier to escape than they imagine. In truth, the primary obstacle between most people and a profoundly better life is the elaborate system of excuses they've built to convince themselves that change is either impossible or not worth pursuing. Freedom is always within reach, but claiming it demands the courage to let go of the comforting narratives that make their captivity feel tolerable. Part 11. The mirror of self-recognition. The hardest person to catch in the act of self-deception is yourself. You can effortlessly recognize when your friends are making excuses, detect projection in your coworkers with sharp clarity, and pinpoint denial in family members with unsettling ease. But spotting your own mental contortions is like watching a magician and trying to figure out how you pulled off the trick while still being the magician. The very tools your mind uses to scrutinize its own reasoning are the same tools responsible for building those rationalizations in the first place. It's like attempting to see your own blind spot or bite your own teeth. The observer and the observed are one and the same. The mind that investigates is also the one under investigation. The judge and the accused reside in the same head. Still, it is possible to recognize these patterns, but doing so demands a form of psychological bravery that most people find deeply unsettling. The first step toward honest self-recognition is developing the ability to notice the faint physical and emotional cues that accompany self-justification in real time. Often, there's a slight tightness in your chest just before you rationalize something you know crosses a line. Your speech may speed up as you try to explain away something you secretly feel ashamed of. You might notice a defensive edge creeping into your voice when someone questions decisions you haven't fully thought through. Your body registers the lie before your mind dares to admit it. Becoming attuned to these bodily signals can serve as an early alert system that your internal justifications are being activated. But cultivating this kind of self-awareness is difficult, and many people instinctively avoid it. Why? Because once you start paying close attention, your comforting illusions become harder to sustain. The language you use to explain your decisions, both to yourself and to others, can also act as a powerful diagnostic tool for identifying justification in motion. Listen for phrases like, "I didn't have a choice," "Anyone would have done the same," "The situation left me no option," or "I was just being practical." Such statements often mask an attempt to reframe personal decisions as unavoidable outcomes, subtly shifting yourself from agent to victim. Watch out for lines like, "I don't usually do this," but, or "This is only temporary until," or "I only did it because." These qualifiers tend to precede elaborate rationalizations for behaviors that go against your own values or conflict with your long-term goals. Another revealing clue is the balance between how long you spend deciding something versus how long you spend justifying it. If you find yourself devoting more time to defending a choice than you did to making it, it's a strong indication you're trying to convince yourself, not just explain things to others. When a decision is sound, it rarely requires a complex defense. Perhaps the most telling indicator of all is how you respond emotionally when someone questions your actions. Do you immediately feel attacked? Do you instinctively dismiss their feedback without giving it serious thought? Do you jump to conclusions about their intentions, assuming they must be selfish, misinformed, or hostile? These reactions often signal that the criticism has struck a nerve, poking holes in your mental defenses and threatening beliefs you've been protecting with layers of justification. Those who are truly secure in their choices tend to meet criticism with openness rather than reactivity. They seek to understand, entertain different viewpoints, and are willing to consider that they might be wrong. In contrast, those clinging to fragile justifications often interpret any questioning as a personal offense, because it threatens the mental structures they've built to shield themselves from facing uncomfortable aspects of who they are. The narratives you craft about your past can also reveal how you're justifying your present. Are you consistently casting yourself as a victim of forces beyond your control? Do you focus on external difficulties while downplaying your own role or responsibility? Do your recollections portray your actions as inevitable, your mistakes as reasonable, and your outcomes as largely determined by factors outside your control? How you interpret your history often mirrors the justifications you use in the present. People who take real ownership of their lives tend to see their past errors as lessons and their successes as results of effort and decision-making. Those who rely heavily on rationalization, however, often view their failures as the fault of bad luck or unfair treatment, and their achievements as proof of their inherent worth, intelligence, or virtue. Your autobiography, no matter how sincere, is inevitably shaped by fiction to some extent. The specific ways you distort or edit your story often highlight the rationalizations you rely on to uphold your current self-image. A powerful method for cutting through these internal defenses is not to attack opposing views with a straw man, but instead to steel man them, constructing the strongest, most compelling version of the argument you disagree with. When someone questions your beliefs or challenges your behavior, it's natural to focus on the weakest elements of their critique. But genuine insight often begins by doing the opposite. Take their position seriously, especially if it unsettles you. Ask yourself what they might perceive that you're overlooking. Even if their tone is harsh or their motives unclear, their critique may still contain valuable truths. This process is profoundly uncomfortable because it demands that you lower the psychological defenses that make you feel justified and secure. Yet it's often the only path to uncovering uncomfortable truths about yourself, truths your mind works hard to obscure. The criticisms that stir your anger or defensiveness are frequently the most crucial ones to explore. Another lens through which to evaluate yourself is the distance between your declared values and your day-to-day actions. Most people can list principles they claim to live by: honesty, integrity, compassion, accountability, but few consistently act in accordance with those ideals. Why? Because living by them is difficult and often comes at a cost. The discrepancy between what you say you value and how you actually behave is usually filled with a web of rationalizations, designed not just to defend your actions, but to make your inconsistencies seem like wisdom. Make an honest inventory of your values, then evaluate how closely your recent behaviors align with them. Where there's a large gap, there's often an elaborate justification structure supporting it, a narrative explaining why your situation is unique and why standard rules don't quite apply. The more complex and detailed this explanation, the more likely it is a shield against acknowledging a failure to live by your own principles. This doesn't necessarily mean you failed morally, but it almost certainly indicates a lapse in self-awareness. The people you surround yourself with and the media you consume offer another mirror. They show how much disagreement and discomfort you allow into your life. Do your social circles reinforce your worldview and validate your decisions? Do you mostly engage with information that aligns with your beliefs while ignoring or discrediting anything that challenges them? Are you quick to label uncomfortable facts as biased while viewing agreeable ones as objective? Those genuinely committed to pursuing truth seek out perspectives that differ from their own. They welcome relationships that challenge them, and they expose themselves to ideas that have the potential to change their minds. In contrast, those more devoted to self-justification tend to construct echo chambers, environments that reinforce existing beliefs and validate the stories they tell themselves. The range of viewpoints you tolerate in your social and intellectual life is often a direct reflection of how open you are to having your rationalizations tested. Perhaps the most revealing exercise is to imagine how you would judge someone else for making the same choices you've made. If a friend stayed in a job they disliked for the same reasons you give yourself, would their reasoning seem valid, or would it sound like a convenient excuse? If a coworker navigated a difficult situation the same way you did, would you admire their judgment or quietly question it? If a stranger acted exactly as you have, would you view their behavior as understandable or problematic? This thought experiment can uncover the double standards created by self-justification. Actions that feel necessary when you perform them may seem misguided or questionable when done by someone else. Often, the critical eye you apply to others reveals just how much leniency you're affording yourself through concealed rationalizations. The ultimate test of self-awareness is your readiness to shift direction the moment you realize you've been lying to yourself. Noticing the excuses you make is only meaningful if you're willing to confront them and change. Yet for many, even when they catch themselves in the act of self-deception, they choose to persist. Why? Because the alternative often feels overwhelming, too painful, too expensive, or simply too uncertain. True psychological bravery isn't just about recognizing the stories you tell yourself. It's about choosing to live without them. It means confronting the uncomfortable possibility that some of your most cherished beliefs might be wrong, that long-avoided changes must now be faced, and that responsibilities you've sidestepped must finally be claimed. It involves giving up the illusion of certainty, even when that certainty feels safe and reassuring, in exchange for the unease that comes with honest uncertainty. But in doing so, you exchange the confinement of self-deception for the freedom that comes with making real, conscious choices. The essential question is this: do you value truth over comfort? Do you prize growth more than the safety of the familiar? Are you willing to embrace possibility, even at the expense of predictability? Your response to these questions will reveal whether you choose to remain confined by your own rationalizations or find the strength to see yourself clearly and live in alignment with that truth. Part 12. The collective delusion. When an entire society begins to adopt the same rationalizations at once, individual self-deception evolves into something far more dangerous: a shared delusion that can endure across generations and lead to the collapse of entire civilizations. History offers countless examples of societies that persuaded themselves that clearly harmful actions were not only permissible, but honorable, virtuous, and necessary. In Nazi Germany, genocide was framed as racial purification and the defense of the nation. In the American South, slavery was upheld as both an economic imperative and a divine mandate. The Soviet regime portrayed mass starvation as a necessary sacrifice for revolutionary advancement and the march of history. These weren't simply instances of malevolent leaders duping innocent citizens. They were cases where everyday people built intricate moral frameworks that allowed them to perceive atrocities as rational, even just. The same psychological mechanisms that drive individual justification are at play, but when multiplied through collective behavior, they gain an unstoppable force. As these rationalizations are echoed through every corner of society, among family, friends, co-workers, spiritual leaders, politicians, and media outlets, they begin to lose their appearance as justifications. Instead, they become indistinguishable from truth. Assumptions about reality that feel so natural and universal, they are no longer questioned. When those around you all endorse the same narrative, rejecting it doesn't just seem controversial, it can appear irrational or even dangerous. Social conformity and the human desire for cognitive consistency combine to create closed loops of reasoning that are extraordinarily hard to break. Consider how entire nations can come to believe their economic systems are fair and effective, even when those systems clearly serve only a privileged few while leaving millions in hardship. The wealthy defend their dominance by casting themselves as essential innovators and providers whose prosperity ultimately benefits all. The middle class accepts their position by believing in the promise of upward mobility, convinced that with enough effort, they too will rise into the elite. Meanwhile, those living in poverty are encouraged to blame their struggles on personal flaws rather than systemic injustices, adopting narratives about self-reliance and failure. Every social class has its own polished narrative to justify why the current order is not only unchangeable, but morally correct. The wealthy cite economic growth and technological advancement as proof that inequality is a necessary component of progress. The middle class holds tightly to ideals like meritocracy and the American dream, which make their hardships feel like meaningful steps on a noble journey rather than evidence of a broken system. For the poor, explanations are often religious or political, either that suffering is spiritually redemptive or that their problems stem from the actions of other marginalized groups rather than the broader system itself. These various forms of justification support and reinforce one another, combining into a collective worldview in which deep inequality appears normal, and efforts to challenge it are seen as naive or dangerous. Media, often owned and influenced by the wealthy, tends to spotlight success stories and tales of personal triumph, while downplaying or ignoring the broader systemic issues that limit opportunity. Schools and universities frequently teach economic theories that assume the current structure is optimal, presenting alternative visions as either outdated or unrealistic. Political systems are designed to protect the interests of those who already benefit, making it difficult for voices advocating change to be heard or taken seriously. Religious institutions often contribute their own endorsements of the status quo, encouraging believers to accept hardship as a test of faith or as the path to eternal reward. The result is an all-encompassing cultural narrative that not only normalizes vast inequality, but portrays it as inevitable, even morally justified. One of the most far-reaching examples of this kind of collective rationalization is humanity's ongoing destruction of the environment. Despite overwhelming scientific consensus that our current patterns of consumption are leading us toward ecological disaster, people in affluent societies largely continue their environmentally damaging lifestyles, supported by complex rationalizations. Individuals often defend their high-carbon habits by arguing that their personal contributions are negligible compared to industrial pollution, or that emerging technologies will resolve the crisis before any real harm is done. Corporations, in turn, justify their environmentally harmful operations by citing consumer demand, adherence to regulations, and obligations to maximize shareholder value. Governments excuse their insufficient action on climate issues by insisting that economic growth is essential to finance environmental efforts, or that acting alone would put them at a competitive disadvantage globally. At every level of society, these explanations form a dense web of self-justification that allows everyone to appear responsible while avoiding meaningful accountability. Consumers blame producers for making harmful products. Producers blame consumers for wanting them. Wealthy nations accuse poorer ones of raising emissions, while developing countries point to the long history of emissions and excessive consumption in the developed world. People alive today blame previous generations for creating the crisis, yet refuse to make sacrifices to safeguard the future for generations to come. The sheer complexity of the situation makes it easy for each group to deflect responsibility and focus on the failures of others, rather than acknowledging their own role. This dynamic creates a textbook example of a collective action problem. Individual decisions may seem rational in isolation, but together they result in catastrophic outcomes. What makes this dysfunction even more insidious is how individual justifications shield people from recognizing the broader irrationality of their collective behavior. Nowhere is this clearer than in the current political climate, where polarization has become a dominant mode of social justification. Large segments of society now believe not only that their political adversaries are mistaken, but that they are morally corrupt, treacherous, or psychologically unstable. Each side has developed intricate narratives explaining why seemingly rational arguments from the other are actually deceptive, manipulative, or delusional. Any information that challenges a preferred worldview is dismissed outright as biased or fake, while affirming information is embraced without scrutiny, no matter its reliability or origin. This feedback loop reinforces itself, making it increasingly difficult for people to recognize valid concerns from across the aisle and more likely to interpret disagreement as proof of bad intentions. The result is the formation of two incompatible social realities, each convinced that the other is deeply deluded, all while failing to perceive its own blind spots. The digital revolution has amplified and accelerated this dynamic. Technologies now segment people into echo chambers that reinforce pre-existing views and serve up content tailored to provoke emotional responses. Social media algorithms designed to optimize engagement tend to prioritize posts that spark outrage or tribal loyalty, often by validating biases and inflaming hostility toward opposing groups. As a result, we now inhabit fragmented information worlds, where different groups receive entirely different versions of the same events and craft divergent narratives about what those events mean. These technologies have industrialized the creation of justifications, automating the generation of personalized narratives that support whatever beliefs and behaviors users already hold. The implications of this collective justification are profound and potentially devastating. When entire societies convince themselves that pressing problems either don't exist or are being adequately addressed, despite clear evidence to the contrary, they lose the ability to adapt. And without the capacity for self-correction, societies become vulnerable not just to ecological collapse, but to any crisis that demands a unified, rational response. Civilizations that fall into the grip of shared illusions often remain trapped until external pressures force a reckoning so profound that the illusions can no longer be sustained. By the time such a reckoning occurs, however, the harm may already be deep and potentially beyond repair. Furthermore, the price of change at that late stage is usually much steeper than it would have been had the underlying issues been recognized and addressed earlier. The most dangerous feature of collective self-deception is how it corrodes the very systems meant to safeguard a society's ability to correct itself. When scientific bodies become entangled in politics, their ability to deliver unbiased, evidence-based insights on matters of public concern is compromised. Similarly, when educational systems are overtaken by ideology, they lose their effectiveness in cultivating independent thought and intellectual integrity. When the media becomes polarized, it fails in its democratic duty to inform the public with accurate and balanced reporting. And when the justice system is tainted, it can no longer function as a fair and neutral enforcer of laws or adjudicator of disputes. The degradation of any one of these institutions increases the fragility of the others, as the number of reliable, independent checks on power and error diminishes. Counteracting collective self-deception is not about relying on courageous individuals, but rather about constructing institutions with built-in incentives that reward honesty and punish distortion. This demands designing systems with overlap and redundancy, ensuring that no single body or interest group can monopolize the dissemination of information. It also means implementing mechanisms for transparency, so that the real costs of mass delusion are visible to those who bear them. Equally vital is the creation of accountability frameworks that directly link authority with responsibility for outcomes. Above all, this effort requires the cultivation of cultural norms that elevate truth over comfort, prize intellectual humility over dogmatic certainty, and value foresight over immediate gratification. Such virtues do not emerge naturally. They are acquired through intentional socialization and must be continually reinforced through institutional practices and cultural norms. Without a conscious effort to challenge our innate tendency to justify comforting falsehoods, societies will inevitably slide into collective myths that soothe the present but sabotage the future. Part 13, Truth or Comfort, the Ultimate Dilemma. At its core, the human tendency to rationalize is not just a psychological quirk, but a deep reflection of an age-old existential dilemma. Is truth inherently valuable, or are there moments when comforting falsehoods serve us better than difficult truths? This is not merely a question for philosophers to ponder in isolation. It's a lived, daily conflict that each of us confronts, consciously or not. Every day we face decisions that hinge on whether we confront reality or retreat into soothing narratives. Would you rather face the painful signs that your relationship is crumbling, or convince yourself that the tension is just a passing phase? Would you prefer to realize that your professional path has narrowed your potential, or believe that external forces have blocked your success? Are you ready to admit that your way of life is unsustainable? Or is it easier to believe that future technologies will solve the problems without requiring you to change? These decisions between truth and comfort don't just influence personal choices, they shape the course of societies. The argument for choosing comfort is more compelling than many truth seekers are willing to acknowledge. After all, humans are not detached reasoning machines, built solely to analyze facts and draw logical conclusions. We are emotional, social beings wired for meaning, connection, and hope, sometimes even at the expense of accuracy. Consider the individual facing a terminal diagnosis. They may find deeper peace and live more fully by believing in a hopeful outcome, rather than surrendering to grim statistics. A struggling community might better preserve unity and morale by holding on to stories of past greatness and future revival, rather than focusing on present hardship. Even humanity, when confronting existential threats, might be more driven to survive and reproduce by minimizing the scale of those dangers, rather than staring them down in despair. Psychological research consistently finds that people with slightly idealized perceptions of themselves, their relationships, and their future tend to be more resilient, happier, and even more successful than those with perfectly accurate self-assessments. The most emotionally stable individuals are often not those who see the world with crystal clarity, but those who interpret reality in ways that support their mental well-being and social bonds. If people were to fully grasp the limits of human capability, the vast indifference of the universe, and the inevitability of death, life might become psychologically unbearable. A certain level of self-deception may be essential, not only for personal health, but for cooperation and survival as a species. The real question, then, is not whether we justify or rationalize, but how much of it is constructive, and when it starts to do more harm than good. Obsessing over total truth can be just as dangerous as surrendering completely to comforting illusions. Still, the long-term case for truth remains stronger. Comforting lies, no matter how well-intentioned, eventually clash with reality, and when they do, the resulting damage is often worse than the original discomfort the truth might have caused. The person who refuses to accept their terminal illness may lose the chance to find closure, make peace with loved ones, or prepare meaningfully for the end. A community that clings to false hope about its economic future may ignore opportunities for reform and resilience. A species that denies its vulnerability may fail to act in time to prevent disaster. Reality does not bend to human desires. The universe operates independently of our beliefs, and the laws of nature remain unmoved by our emotional needs. Furthermore, the emotional safety offered by illusions often undermines long-term growth, maturity, and authentic relationships. Those who consistently choose the ease of illusion over the discomfort of truth can become detached from both the world around them and from people who see them clearly. They may build elaborate defense mechanisms to guard their illusions, but those defenses can become walls that block out genuine connection and honest feedback. Their relationships lose depth, reduced to performances that depend on mutual denial rather than shared truth. As time passes, their judgment falters because it's based on distorted perceptions. While they may experience a surface-level happiness, they miss out on the deeper fulfillment that only comes from self-awareness and honest engagement with the world. The societal consequences of prioritizing emotional ease over factual accuracy are profound. Democracies rely on citizens who can think critically and make informed decisions about complex issues. When large portions of the population favor comforting falsehoods over hard truths about economics, science, history, or social challenges, the very foundation of democratic decision-making begins to crumble. Market economies, too, are sustained by the availability of reliable information about prices, risks, and opportunities. When misinformation, whether intentional or self-imposed, skews this information, markets cease to function efficiently and resources are misused. The engine of scientific advancement depends on the humility of researchers to admit when their ideas fall short and to revise their theories in light of new evidence. When political or financial interests infiltrate scientific institutions and demand predetermined outcomes, the integrity of the entire knowledge-building process is compromised. Social trust, which underpins cooperative behavior and shared commitments, rests on the assumption that people generally speak truthfully and honor their promises. When rationalization becomes so widespread that it erodes shared standards of truth and accountability, the result is a collapse in the ability to collaborate and solve collective problems. Perhaps most critically, the dilemma is not usually a stark choice between full honesty and complete delusion. More often, the challenge lies in navigating the tension between psychological comfort and factual clarity. This balancing act requires what might be termed calibrated honesty, the capacity to confront difficult realities gradually, in tolerable amounts, supported by effective coping mechanisms and strong social networks. This approach involves learning to differentiate between benign illusions that support emotional well-being and dangerous falsehoods that impair judgment. It calls for building the emotional strength and relational depth necessary to make the pursuit of truth sustainable, even when it's uncomfortable. Most people require a baseline of hope, confidence, and self-worth to function well, yet they also need a firm grip on reality in order to make wise choices and respond to life's evolving challenges. The cultivation of calibrated honesty may be one of the most essential tasks in human psychological development. Children instinctively engage in wishful thinking and self-serving beliefs to shield themselves from the fears that come with dependence and vulnerability. Maturing means learning to tolerate increasingly complex and uncomfortable truths about oneself and the world, without losing the drive to grow or the optimism to persevere. This is a lifelong process. Each phase of life presents new emotional and existential tests. Older adults confronting the reality of mortality, middle-aged individuals reflecting on unfulfilled aspirations, and young adults discovering the limits of their abilities, all face crucial decisions between confronting truth or retreating into illusion. The outcomes of these decisions depend largely on their ability to derive purpose and meaning from accurate self-awareness, rather than clinging to comforting fictions. Ultimately, the deeper issue may not lie in choosing between truth and comfort, but in deciding how to relate to the beliefs one holds. Those who recognize that their convictions are inherently incomplete and potentially flawed can adjust them in light of new insights. People who understand that their sense of self is shaped rather than uncovered can alter it when change serves their growth. Likewise, individuals who accept that their worldview is an interpretation, not an absolute fact, can remain receptive to different perspectives in evolving realities. This form of intellectual humility opens the door to what might be called intentional self-deception, the conscious decision to focus on certain truths while temporarily setting others aside, with a full understanding of the rationale and purpose behind this choice. Handled skillfully, this selective awareness can preserve the psychological benefits of optimism and focus, while retaining the flexibility to recalibrate when needed. In the end, the central question may not be whether to favor truth or comfort, but whether human beings can cultivate the discernment to know when each is appropriate and the bravery to act accordingly. Achieving this balance requires profound self-awareness, emotional maturity, and a supportive social environment, qualities that are rare in individuals and even rarer in societies. Yet the alternative is stagnation, a life governed by unconscious justifications that restrict growth and limit potential. Choosing between truth and comfort is, at its core, choosing between autonomy and entrapment, between living authentically and merely performing, between genuine human connection and collective self-deception. It is a decision that ultimately defines what it means to live fully in a world that promises nothing but the consequences of our own choices. Part 14. The possibility of authentic living. After exploring the many strategies we use to deceive ourselves, the subtle avoidance of discomfort, the intricate defenses we construct to sidestep truth, and the elaborate justifications we offer for the indefensible, a pressing question comes into view. Is true honesty within reach for human beings, or are we inevitably trapped in varying levels of self-deception? This isn't an abstract or purely intellectual puzzle. It strikes at the heart of everyday existence. If honest self-understanding is fundamentally out of reach, then countless human enterprises, from psychotherapy to education to personal growth, are built on shaky foundations. But if authentic honesty is attainable, it suggests that the vast majority of people are falling short of their potential and overlooking the possibility of profound inner transformation. How we answer this question defines whether the human experience is inherently tragic or filled with promise. It influences how we navigate relationships, career paths, ethical dilemmas, and the broader question of how to live a meaningful life. A more skeptical view, one supported by a wealth of psychological research, argues that self-deception is so deeply embedded in human cognition that absolute honesty might not only be unreachable, but also counterproductive. From this perspective, our minds evolved not to perceive reality with precision, but to enhance our chances of survival and reproduction within the specific social environments our ancestors faced. The very cognitive tools that once enabled us to thrive in close-knit groups now produce systematic distortions, creating blind spots that skew our self-understanding in today's world. We are biologically inclined to view ourselves as more capable, more virtuous, more intelligent, and more attractive than we actually are. These flattering illusions aren't accidental. They foster confidence, support social connection, and help us persevere in the face of failure. For many, confronting the full weight of human limitations, existential insignificance, and inevitable mortality could be emotionally overwhelming. A certain amount of self-deception may even be essential for psychological resilience, smooth social interactions, and the continued survival of our species. Additionally, the deeply social nature of human life means that personal honesty is often dependent on shared, collective honesty, posing immense coordination challenges. You cannot fully reveal your inner world if doing so would alienate you from loved ones, jeopardize your career, or separate you from your community. Social living necessitates countless subtle distortions and compromises. These small deceptions keep the machinery of human cooperation running and help avoid constant interpersonal friction. Political systems often require citizens to accept simplified stories about issues too complex for any one person to grasp. Economies function in part because people hold hopeful beliefs about their future income and accept explanations for their place in society that may gloss over deeper structural truths. Even our most personal connections, romantic partnerships, close friendships, family ties, often depend on shared understandings, selective forgiveness, and quiet agreements to overlook certain imperfections. Total honesty, taken to its extreme, could unravel the intricate trust and cohesion that make human society work at all. In some cases, the pursuit of pure authenticity might isolate individuals to such a degree that it negates the very human connection it aims to deepen. Still, there is another perspective, one grounded in ancient wisdom and supported by therapeutic disciplines across cultures, that holds a more hopeful view. According to this outlook, human beings are capable of reaching remarkable levels of self-awareness and genuine living, provided they are willing to engage in the necessary inner work. Buddhist traditions, for instance, have refined meditation techniques that allow practitioners to observe their own minds with exceptional clarity, watching thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations arise and pass away without becoming entangled in them. Psychoanalytic traditions have created powerful tools for bringing unconscious motives and hidden behavioral patterns into conscious awareness. Existential thinkers have laid out pathways for embracing full responsibility for one's actions and crafting authentic meaning in a universe that offers no guarantees. Contemporary therapeutic methods show that people can break lifelong habits of self-sabotage and build more constructive, compassionate relationships with others and with themselves. Despite their differences, these approaches converge on a central insight. While perfect objectivity about the self may remain out of reach, significant growth in self-awareness and authentic expression is entirely possible. The most important lesson from these diverse paths is that honesty should be seen not as a fixed goal, but as an evolving practice. Authentic living is not a static state of complete self-understanding that we eventually arrive at. Rather, it is an ongoing dynamic process of reflection, discovery, and integration, a lifelong journey toward deeper truth. Living authentically means developing the bravery to confront difficult truths about yourself, gradually and with appropriate support. This path requires environments that encourage growth without becoming overwhelming, and it depends on strengthening your capacity to regulate emotions so that you can face discomfort without being consumed by it or retreating into denial and rationalization. It also calls for building connections with people who can truly see you and still offer unconditional love. These relationships create the safety necessary for vulnerability to flourish. At its core, authentic living is about discovering meaning and purpose through honest self-understanding, not through comforting lies. This journey tends to follow several identifiable phases, although the progression is often messy, nonlinear, and subject to repetition. The first phase is usually sparked by some form of crisis or deep dissatisfaction, an event that disrupts your current self-narrative and makes old patterns of self-deception unsustainable. It might be a failed relationship that compels you to look at your own contributions to conflict, a career disappointment that challenges your identity, or a health scare that forces you to reckon with your mortality and physical limitations. The next stage involves acquiring the resources and support necessary for honest introspection. This might mean starting therapy, adopting a meditation practice, having candid conversations with trusted friends, or engaging in journaling and other reflective practices that allow you to observe and evaluate your internal patterns with clarity. The third phase is the heart of the work, confronting painful truths and incorporating them into a more nuanced and accurate sense of self. This part can be especially difficult, as it often requires letting go of comforting illusions and taking responsibility for issues previously blamed on others or attributed to circumstance. Following this is a stage where you begin to live in alignment with your revised self-understanding. Your choices start to reflect reality-based insight rather than wishful thinking or defensiveness. While this process offers significant rewards, they are often different from what people expect at the outset. Greater self-honesty may not result in immediate happiness, but it usually brings deeper freedom, authenticity, and personal effectiveness. Individuals who achieve a more accurate understanding of themselves often report a greater sense of inner peace, even when they don't particularly like everything they uncover. They experience less internal conflict because they are no longer juggling contradictions between how they see themselves and how they actually behave. Their relationships tend to become more intimate and sincere as they begin to engage with others from a place of truth rather than performance. Decision-making also improves as it becomes grounded in realistic assessments of one's strengths, weaknesses, and circumstances, rather than distorted by fantasy or fear. These individuals grow more resilient in the face of criticism and setbacks because their self-worth is no longer tethered to illusions that external events can easily shatter. Most importantly, they cultivate an ongoing capacity for growth, since they are no longer attached to rigid self-concepts that hinder learning and adaptation. Yet choosing to live authentically is not without its costs and dangers, which should not be understated. Greater honesty often reveals that some relationships were built on mutual denial and cannot survive the shift toward truth. Certain career choices or lifestyles that once seemed desirable may turn out to be rooted in false beliefs about your interests, talents, or values. You might come to realize that some long-pursued ambitions weren't truly your own, but inherited from others' expectations or imposed by societal norms. This realization often brings with it a period of mourning for lost illusions, missed chances, and roads never traveled. It demands accepting that some challenges are unsolvable, some limitations are permanent, and certain dreams will remain unfulfilled. For those who have relied on hopeful delusions, this kind of acceptance can be initially crushing, even if it ultimately leads to deeper calm and clarity. The journey toward authentic living often passes through a period that feels like a dark night of the soul, when old sources of meaning have been stripped away and new ones have yet to be found. The social repercussions of this transformation are also profound. People who achieve genuine self-awareness frequently discover they are at odds with social norms and group dynamics, which often rely on shared illusions and unspoken agreements to maintain cohesion. People may begin to withdraw from conversations that demand they pretend to agree with ideas they don't genuinely support, or from relationships that require them to perform rather than show up as their true selves. This shift can leave them feeling alienated from groups that struggle to accept the level of honesty they've come to prioritize. Yet in stepping away from these environments, many also discover new communities and relationships rooted in values they didn't previously know they shared. These new connections often form around a mutual dedication to personal growth, truth-seeking, and authentic human interaction. Although the process of transitioning can feel isolating and unsettling, it frequently opens the door to richer, more fulfilling bonds than those they experienced before. In the end, living authentically may have less to do with relentless honesty and more to do with making intentional, self-aware choices. Such choices involve discerning when and how to engage in various forms of self-deception. Instead of being unconsciously driven by internal justifications, individuals can develop the ability to observe these mental processes in action. This awareness allows them to consciously decide which beliefs and self-identities are constructive and which ones should be re-examined or left behind. This mindful approach protects the psychological advantages of selective focus and optimistic interpretation, while also fostering the adaptability needed for continual development. It helps individuals remain hopeful and motivated without losing sight of reality. It supports sincere relationships with others while still honoring the social norms of cooperation and mutual care. Most significantly, it upholds human agency and personal responsibility, all while recognizing the inevitable constraints and limitations that are part of the human condition. While authenticity doesn't demand absolute honesty at all times, it does call for a clear-eyed awareness of when and why we choose to withhold complete truth from ourselves or from others. Part 15. Breaking the spell. You have lived your whole life inside an illusion so seamless, so deeply woven into the fabric of your existence that you never even noticed it. Just as a fish cannot comprehend the concept of water until it leaves the ocean, you've existed within systems of justification so complete and persuasive that they have disguised themselves as reality. But now everything is different. You've begun to see how these systems operate. You've traced their influence through the realms of psychology and philosophy, through political ideologies, religious doctrines, corporate cultures, cult dynamics, personal lives, and entire civilizations. The veil has lifted. Ignorance is no longer an option. The spell that once bound you is unraveling, and with its dissolution comes a daunting kind of freedom and an extraordinary opening of potential. The real question is no longer whether you'll engage in justification, because you inevitably will, but whether you'll do it with awareness or without it. Will your justifications be conscious, intentional, and constructive, or unconscious, reactive, and harmful? The degree to which you can choose your own illusions may be the closest approximation of true freedom that human beings ever attain. To begin freeing yourself from automatic self-justification, you must first understand that every narrative you construct about your life, every rationale you give for your actions, every worldview you adopt is a fabrication, not a discovery. You are not unearthing timeless truths about your identity, your past, or your potential. You are, moment by moment, crafting interpretations that meet psychological needs within specific contexts. This doesn't mean your interpretations are false or meaningless. It means they are temporary and subject to change, not absolute or eternal. When you recognize that you are the narrator, not the victim, of your own story, you start to own your role in shaping its direction, its characters, and its conclusion. You stop being confined by outdated narratives that no longer reflect who you are, and instead begin creating new stories aligned with your highest aspirations. This process of intentional storymaking relies on developing what can be called metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe your own thoughts as they unfold. It's the skill of catching yourself mid-rationalization, noticing when you're projecting your own unresolved issues onto others, and recognizing when you're denying what is plainly true. It means tuning into the subtle emotional and physical cues that accompany moments of justification, that tension in your chest before you excuse something you know you shouldn't, the sharp edge in your voice when someone questions a decision you haven't fully faced, the complex explanations that spill out when a simple truth would suffice. Metacognitive awareness is like a mental muscle. It strengthens with deliberate practice, but weakens when ignored. The more you cultivate this internal observation, the more choices become available to you. You gain the power to decide which thought patterns to follow and which to abandon. But make no mistake, this is hard work. It demands persistence and immense patience. These patterns of justification have developed over decades. They are not only etched into your neural pathways, but reinforced by your social environments. Another vital tool in escaping the trap of unconscious justification is the cultivation of intellectual humility. This means accepting that your worldview, no matter how carefully considered, is inevitably shaped and limited by your personal experiences, biology, culture, and circumstances. It requires acknowledging that you may be mistaken, even about beliefs you hold with deep conviction. And it means being open to the possibility that those who challenge your views might possess insights you've overlooked. To practice intellectual humility is not to abandon all beliefs or become paralyzed by indecision. Rather, it is to hold your convictions with a light touch, firm enough to act upon them, but flexible enough to adapt when better evidence presents itself. This is one of the most difficult steps in breaking the spell of justification because it involves letting go of the comfort that comes from certainty, and yet it is also the most freeing. Once you stop defending fixed answers, you gain access to a vast landscape of questions, possibilities, and insights that were previously unavailable. This openness allows for genuine growth and authentic exploration. Sustainable honesty, however, requires a supportive social foundation. Most people cling to their justifications because they are terrified of what honest self-reflection might reveal, that they are flawed, inadequate, or unworthy of love. To counter this fear, they need relationships in which they are seen clearly and loved nonetheless. When others accept you without illusion, it creates the safety required for true vulnerability. These kinds of relationships make it possible to confront your justifications honestly and to live more authentically. They provide the trust that gives you the courage to question your own stories and the freedom to write new ones. Genuine growth in relationships requires moving beyond the comfort of mutual illusions. Instead of reinforcing each other's self-deceptions, truly transformative connections are built on a shared dedication to honesty and personal development. These kinds of bonds are uncommon precisely because they demand that both individuals prioritize truth over ease and evolution over stability. Yet they are vital, as personal attempts to escape the cycle of self-justification often falter under the influence of collective expectations. Social conformity and the desire to align with group narratives can quickly undo progress made toward self-awareness. Those who manage to form authentic connections frequently notice that while they may interact with fewer people overall, the depth and sincerity of their relationships improve significantly. They move away from shallow exchanges that rely on performance and mask-wearing, and instead cultivate friendships grounded in honesty and emotional richness. A key element in this transformation is learning to face discomfort and uncertainty with resilience. Whether through mindfulness practices that train you to observe challenging emotions without being ruled by them, therapeutic work that helps you navigate trauma without letting it define you, or physical disciplines that enhance your endurance and stress capacity, the techniques vary, but the principle remains the same. You must strengthen your ability to sit with psychological discomfort without instinctively fleeing into denial, rationalizations, or blame shifting. Most justifications exist to protect us from painful emotions related to our identity, actions, or situation. But once you become capable of experiencing difficult emotions without being consumed by them, the need for complex defense mechanisms begins to fade. This isn't about glorifying suffering or seeking out hardship for its own sake. Rather, it's about building the inner strength to confront the truths you uncover about yourself and your life without falling apart. At its core, freeing yourself from self-justification involves discovering sources of meaning that don't rely on maintaining illusions about who you are or what the world is. Many avoid deep self-inquiry because they fear it will strip their lives of purpose. If you realize your professional ambitions stem more from a craving for approval than from authentic passion, what motivation remains to strive? If you accept that your faith was shaped more by culture than divine insight, what becomes the basis for moral action? If you recognize that your romantic commitments contain as much fantasy and projection as genuine intimacy, how do you justify loyalty and sacrifice? These are not questions with easy or tidy answers, but they invite a deeper exploration into ways of finding meaning that are not dependent on comforting fictions. Pursuing these questions can lead to what might be called existential authenticity, the capacity to generate purpose through deliberate, conscious choice rather than inherited programming or unconscious drives. This path involves assuming full responsibility, not just for what you do, but for why you value what you value. Not only for your choices, but also for your desires. Not simply for your worldview, but for your fundamental orientation to existence itself. It is the recognition that you can choose to live a meaningful life even while fully acknowledging its impermanence, ambiguity, and inevitable end. You can decide to love others even as you understand that love is shaped by psychological patterns and evolutionary design. You can dedicate yourself to ethical living, even knowing that your moral instincts are rooted in cultural history rather than universal law. This capacity for conscious, value-driven decision-making may represent the highest expression of human freedom, the ability to forge significance through intention and integrity, rather than seek it in external authority or illusion. And yet this journey is never truly finished. Every new experience, loss, or transformation will challenge the authenticity you've built, offering new opportunities to deepen your truth or retreat into comfort. The work of living authentically is ongoing, ever evolving, and endlessly worth the effort. Major life changes, unexpected losses, shifting social roles, and the natural process of aging all challenge the boundaries of your self-understanding. These experiences demand that you continually reshape how you see yourself and the world around you. The objective isn't to achieve some ultimate state of honesty, but rather to cultivate the tools and relationships that allow you to keep growing throughout your life. Authenticity in this light is not a finish line to cross, but a path to walk, a daily discipline, a guiding principle, a sustained commitment rather than a static state. Yet perhaps the most profound realization from this journey is that what often seems like a flaw, our ability to deceive ourselves, might actually be among humanity's greatest strengths, provided it's wielded consciously. The same mental agility that allows us to justify harmful actions also enables us to sustain hope when circumstances are bleak, to uncover meaning within sorrow, and to push forward when a strictly logical view might tell us to give up. The challenge lies in learning to direct this psychological flexibility toward personal growth and deeper connection, rather than letting it trap us in denial or isolation. You have the power to focus on truths that support your highest potential, while still being fully aware that this focus is a choice you are making. You can foster hope for the future without denying the inherent uncertainties. You can draw strength from the idealized version of who you want to be, even as you work with the reality of who you are right now. Breaking the spell of unconscious rationalization doesn't require silence or the end of self-narration. It requires awareness. When you finally recognize that you are the one crafting these stories, you step into a deeper level of self-awareness. In that moment, you realize you've always played both roles, the illusionist and the spectator, the writer and the protagonist, the captor and the captive. And in recognizing your role in your own confinement, you simultaneously uncover your capacity to set yourself free. The mental contortions of justification don't have to cease entirely, but they can evolve from automatic reactions into deliberate decisions. The very flexibility that once sustained your self-deception can now serve as the engine of your most genuine self-expression. The real question isn't whether you will shape reality to meet your inner needs. You will. The question is whether you'll do it in ways that deepen your humanity or diminish it. That decision is always available to you, and its impact is always significant. At every point, you can choose courage over comfort, expansion over safety, authenticity over performance. These choices don't just affect your internal world. They ripple outward, shaping your relationships, your work, your community, and ultimately the legacy you leave behind. When you choose conscious honesty instead of unconscious justification, you release yourself from unseen restraints, and you also become part of a much-needed collective awakening. In a culture saturated with denial and deception, each individual who chooses to live authentically becomes a source of light for those still lost in their illusions. The illusion can be shattered, the chains can fall away, the performance can end. And what remains is the bold, daunting, and beautiful possibility of living as your true self. Not the version you've constructed to survive or to be accepted, but the one you've hidden beneath all those stories. The elaborate justifications have run their course. Now begins the far more difficult and infinitely more fulfilling work of living a truly authentic human life.